Lam cementing his role as the de facto head in Vietnam's political system, a unanimous vote at the Central Committee that will see him keep his position as General Secretary for a full 5-year term. The decision at the conclusion of what's seen as the most important event on the political calendar, the once every 5 years National Party Congress. The consensus on who should lead, suggesting a strong mandate for Lam to stay the course on an agenda prioritizing growth and investment. And more CNN senior correspondent Leong Wai-kit joins us live from Hanoi. Wai-kit, he has been re-elected, Mr. Lam, making very clear that reform stays on his cards. What will we see in his first full term as party chief?
Well, definitely putting Vietnam on track to achieve the ultimate goal in 2045, which is to uplift the lives, the quality of lives of Vietnamese, and also making Vietnam a high-income country. Now, this is, of course, not a new point, but Mr. Lam had stressed this point again after the Congress had wrapped up during a media interview. And he also said that the levers that Vietnam can use would include beefing up knowledge-based economy as well as innovation and tapping on digital transformation. Now, he may also be seeking to combine the role of General Secretary and president. Now, of course, this is not confirmed yet, but if this were true, it may not come as a surprise because he had briefly held both roles in 2024. Now, what's also interesting is this list of the Politburo members that was just released. The names are not listed in alphabetical order. At the very top of the list is Mr. Tolam, and it appears that the names are listed in order of prominence. So if you read down the list, one interpretation could be that the role of General Secretary and President could be held by Mr. Tolam. That said, I must stress that this is not confirmed. What is confirmed is that his bid to combine both roles have been widely talked about and widely reported.
All right, Mike, it will stress that, of course, that that role as state president far from confirmed, but he is re-elected as party chief, and that no surprise as well, both regionally and globally.
Well, that's right. So for countries in the region looking inward to Vietnam, one signal that they will get is that there's leadership continuity and therefore there's stability, which is great news for the region, given that in geopolitics, there's a lot of unpredictability today. For investors, of course, music to their ears, especially when there is commitment from Mr. Tolam to cut red tape and get rid of corruption. Now, foreign policy has been quite prominently discussed at the Congress this time round. Mr. Tolam is, of course, known to have been able to maintain good ties with many major powers. In fact, at the press conference earlier, he also stressed that Vietnam could play a bigger role in geopolitics, including working with other countries to resolve issues multilaterally, as well as being a mediator for peace.
Oh, thanks. CNA senior correspondent Leong Wai-Kit reporting live from Hanoi. The conclusion of this once-in-5-year party congress.
Hello, everyone. How's it going? Welcome. Thank you for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about Vietnam. So, as the video just stated, there's been a leadership, not a change, but a reaffirmation of the incumbent. So there's some stability there in Vietnam, as you can see. Interesting questions to ask as far as is Vietnam still a communist country, kind of thing like that. I'd say yes. Well, a socialist country run by a communist party, and so, but there's questions worth asking as far as how do we think of the Vanguard today around the world and in our own countries? We hear the accusations of vassal states being thrown around, and how do we understand situations like Vietnam being a strategic trading partner of both the US and China and the EU, and how do we reconcile that with our ideological positions or biases that we have? So I think it should be a very interesting discussion. So I don't really know too much about the leadership there, this Tolam figure, and who was the leaders previously. I was doing a little bit of a different sort of angle on the research, as far as not so much looking into the personalities of who's in charge, and more so the history and some of the contemporary issues that Vietnam is facing. So one thing that we mentioned on Tuesday, someone was asking us some questions about communism, and then I sort of brought up the Sino-Soviet split in my response, so we can get a little bit more into that. I feel that Vietnam's experience after the Vietnam War is a very much neglected part of history that is extremely important as far as understanding the situation in Southeast Asia today. And so, yeah, I think, and as far as understanding how to treat China's, how should we say, like how revolutionary is China still today? I think when we analyze the history with the war that Vietnam had with China, and China's, I would say, complicity with the U.S. in propping up the Pol Pot regime, these sorts of things, I think, give a little bit more of a concrete substance to the criticisms of China's more imperialistic nature. There's a lot of propaganda that China does that claims that it's always been this benevolent force. It's, you know, their aim is to be the peaceful, like next leader of the global economy sort of thing. And there's a lot of skepticism, which is brushed off as anti-communist badgering and whining and whatnot. So I think it's all stuff that we need to be talking about, whether we get painted as non-Marxist or Western leftist chauvinist kind of stuff. We have to have the ability to speak our positions in order to be able to work our way through them and evolve beyond them if need be, or be validated in criticisms that have been long misunderstood. So let's see. Pardon me. Let me shut that off here. Let me see where I want to pivot to first off. Another aspect I wanted to get into is with Vietnam is the Great Reset conversation, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because in the West there's a lot of fear and pessimism and you know, this kind of very strong stances against the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the World Economic Forum, and these are the capitalist elites that that are our enemies, that we should be taking down and destroying as much as possible. And China, Vietnam, other parts of the world are apparently allowed to be allies with the WEF, you know, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't sit right with me. And it's the kind of thing I think that weakens the people who are more the China cheerleaders, because a lot of the times when they're not talking about China, they will have a very hardcore stance against these institutions, these kinds of things, and then they have a kind of a hypocrisy when it comes to China. That's not really something that they might believe that they're defending it, but I wouldn't really see it as a effective defense. So so let me just find an article here to start with. There's also the South China Sea dispute. As far as everyone's talking, got a lot of opinions about sovereignty these days. And so how committed are you to your own positions? Because if sovereignty is important if respecting China's sovereignty is important, then respecting Vietnam's sovereignty is important. The size of the country doesn't matter when we're talking about sovereignty. It's the accusations of imperialism and colonialism have everything to do with the violations of sovereignty. So if you're a country that is decided to have double standards about sovereignty, that is where we have valid critiques about imperialism, I would say. So yeah, let me just start off with yeah, I'm just not sure where to start with. So I think maybe I'll start with the Sino-Vietnamese. We'll start with history and work our way forward. How about that? So I have a video by Luna Oy that I'll get to. She's a great, you know, the thing that we often struggle with, if we lack connections with people around the world, we might not have a source within the country that we can rely on. We should always hear from the people that we're talking about whenever we can, as opposed to just speak our own opinions about a culture we probably don't understand very well. So if you've never heard of Luna Oy, she's a Marxist-Leninist YouTube commentator. I believe her podcast is called the Luna Oi podcast, and she also has a collaboration she does with I think it's her husband or boyfriend or something like that. I'm forgetting his name at the moment and the name of their collaboration, so I'll have to look up that in a minute. While I get playing that video, I'll look that up. But in the meantime, I just wanted to read a bit of an article, show more than one narrative about the Sino-Vietnamese War, as opposed to just showing you a one-sided conversation from the Vietnamese, I suppose. So I guess this is an Australian website, though. Australians in the Mediterranean, historyguild.org. So let's see the Western kind of neoliberal take on it, maybe. I'm not sure. Let's just read it. Like, share, and subscribe if you're just tuning in. Thanks. I should actually, before I get jumping into stuff, in case you haven't noticed, I'm here by myself today. Abby was unfortunately, she might be able to join us a bit by phone, but she's got some picking up a van for her mom kind of thing. She's got to do a bunch of driving today. She's got to go drop off her brother for a job kind of thing. So it's not like she's just skipping out for no reason. She's got to do that, be there for the people who need her. So, but we'll see Abby again shortly enough. She'll be back on Tuesday probably. So, hopefully she'll be able to tune in. But if not, she's busy. That's okay. I got this, right? So, here's the Sino-Vietnamese War article from December 13th, 2022, but it's a historical article. So, the Sino-Vietnamese War was a short, nasty conflict fought between China and Vietnam in early 1979, largely forgotten by almost everybody, including the belligerents. I don't know about that. It was a side plot of the Sino-Soviet split, itself a sideshow to the Gulf War. Let's go over the events before, during, and after the war to see what it was all about. By Fergus O'Sullivan. Vietnam and China have a long history of conflict, but the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 is a little different. For one, it was short, lasting less than a month, and its goal was, well, a little murky. Depending on how you interpret events, you could call it a successful punitive expedition, a failed invasion, or something else entirely. The war in context. What most historians agree on, though, is that the war is part of two other important historical movements. The Sino-Soviet split, which saw the two largest communist powers at each other's throat, and the Indochina Wars. Many historians will call this conflict the Third Indochina War, where the uprising against the French was the first, and the war between North and South Vietnam was the second, and the third being the Sino-Vietnamese War. When studying these conflicts, the focus is usually on Vietnam. Of the countries in Southeast Asia, it's the largest and most populous. It's also the most famous, simply because the Americans fought there and they made many historical films depicting events there. However, there was fighting all over the area, including between the countries themselves. The fight that sparked Chinese intervention was the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam. Though the intentions of Vietnam weren't entirely humanitarian in nature, it should be noted that the invasion ended the regime of Pol Pot, the madman who ran Cambodia from 1976 to 1979 and had at least 1.5 million of his countrymen murdered during that time. And so, just reading that little paragraph there, if you don't know anything about communism and stuff, but you know, a lot of us have heard about the horrors of the Pol Pot regime without being very politically aware. The thought that seems to bubble up, I would imagine, to the vast majority of people's mind would be, what the fuck are you doing, China, invading Vietnam if they are ending a genocidal regime? Very good question. I think we should be actually asking, not rhetorically. Ties that bind. Of course, you may wonder why China even cared about Vietnam invading Cambodia. This is where the Sino-Soviet split comes into play. Over the years between the death of Stalin and particularly of Khrushchev's denunciation of the crimes perpetrated by the Man of Steel's regime, the once warm relationship enjoyed by the two great communist states had cooled considerably. In fact, what it had grown into was a little Cold War all of its own between the two, with other communist states drawn into the orbit of one or the other. Due to China's small geopolitical reach, in contrast to now, This battle was mostly fought in China's backyard, Mongolia in the north and Indochina in the south. In this mini Cold War, Laos and Cambodia's regimes were backed by the Chinese, while Vietnam received help from the Soviet Union. It should be noted that though China offered some help, most of the firepower the Americans faced in Vietnam was supplied by the Soviets. Naturally, China wasn't too enthused by having a Soviet-friendly country right next door, and having it then invade a friendly country and depose its leader, especially irked Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party chairman. I would also criticize that Deng Xiaoping may be kind of instrumental in the war happening at all, whereas if a different leader had been in power, and this was when he had just taken power after the death of Mao, I believe. So it's the kind of thing, as far as Deng Xiaoping in modern history is often lauded as like a very, very great man who's done so many great things for China. And I feel like we always got to be, in order to rein things back to a little bit of a historically objective position, we have to be sure not to be whitewashing like crimes of a high nature, such as instigating wars, massive wars that don't need to happen. If you want to, that may, or you could dispute whether that's a crime, right? But I would say supporting Pol Pot's regime was a crime. So yeah. Vietnam was warned several times to knock it off, but trusting in their powerful benefactors' protection, they went right ahead and continued military action against Cambodia. This spurred China into action, and it invaded on February 7th, 1979. This is also right after Vietnam just finished the war against the Americans, and they had, I forget how many died, like millions of people died in that conflict and were displaced. And then they had a very bloody war fought between Cambodia and with China. So as far as why is Vietnam like such a advocate of peace today, all you need to know is that it just a couple generations ago, it's been through several bloodbaths. So give them a break, give them some credit. So that spurred China into action and invaded on February 7th, 1979. The goal, ostensibly at least, was to force Vietnam to leave Cambodia. So the war starts. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 is often described as a border war, mainly because the fighting didn't go more than 100 kilometers from the border between the two countries, and it's surprising how few men China committed to the fight. Figures are contested, but it was somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 soldiers. The reason it only brought limited force to bear was because the rest of its massive army was up near the Russian and Mongolian borders to meet an invasion of the Soviets who may or may not come to their allies' aid. I see right there some parallels between Russia's situation in Ukraine right now, where people are wondering why they're taking such a long time, why they're not engaging with the full force of their military. Well, because they have to have a large majority, a huge bulk of their forces need to be on standby in case of a greater war with NATO. So great power conflict is so much fun. Also, there seems to have been some hubris on China's part. The regular Vietnamese army only had about 100,000 or so men under arms, meaning that even with the lowest estimates, the Chinese had a serious advantage. Which often happens. People assume that if the enemy's army is small, that they're going to lose. And history of military conflict demonstrates time and time again that the smaller force can overwhelmingly defeat the larger force if they know their tactics and their discipline right and all that. What the Chinese didn't count on was Vietnam's massive irregular forces, hardened by years of fighting the U.S. in the jungles of the South. It's odd that Beijing made such a vital miscalculation because the Americans had fallen into the same trap just a few years previously. It's also strange that Beijing allowed themselves to be manipulated into doing this because the Americans wanted this kind of divide and conquer happening, where if the communists are eating themselves, then America doesn't even need to, they can do nothing and win, ironically. And so there's a lot of mistakes, I think, that we need to acknowledge. Communism may be a superior system to capitalism, but communists are human beings, right? They're still fallible. So, guerrillas in the midst. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese ran into trouble almost immediately. According to Chinese sources, the goal was to capture a few cities near the border to show they meant business and then withdraw, or maybe maintain a small, limited occupation. It's a little unclear. However, the fighting turned out to be a lot tougher than expected, and progress was very slow. The Vietnamese had little interest in fighting a stand-up war and fought guerrilla campaigns that focused on slowing down the invaders more than anything and then bleeding them with pinprick attacks. When you're the invading force, it's more incumbent on you to take aggressive aims to win the conflict, and the defending force just has to make it a Pyrrhic victory at least, and that's how they most likely make it more than that. As a result, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was able to capture its main objectives. These cities, I have no idea how to. Cao Bang, Lao Kai, and Lang Son. They got some very difficult language barriers here, but ended up needing a lot more men than they expected, and every step ended up being fought for. Realizing they would probably die a death of 1,000 cuts, they declared victory and retreated across the border. That's one way to end a war, I guess. With the Chinese retreat on March 6, 1979, the Vietnamese in turn declared a victory of their own and threw a big party across the country. The Vietnamese take is honestly a little more believable, as they quickly reoccupied their own territory, and Vietnamese forces would remain in Cambodia another 10 years, which was very much against China's wishes. So who won that war? I'd say China lost. And that was the last war that they fought, technically speaking, I believe. So the winner may be in dispute. There is no question of who the losers were. The war cost the lives of 50,000 to 100,000 people, depending on who you believe. Whatever the real figure may be, it seems that they paid a very high price for China's power politics. So, that is the Western liberal world order perspective. So as far as the truth for that, anybody in the chat have some comments? I think in general, there's like a basic correct framing to it without getting, it's not really getting too much into the ideological conflicts and stuff. But Cobra says, funny times back then was like the era of revisionism, because the USSR was also all fucked up thanks to Khrushchev. Don't get me wrong, I like Xi in China today. Dang, not so much. There's a whole lot of history I gotta read up on this, but I'm finding it hard to be, like, I'm maybe not liking like Xi in China as much as others. The more I look into it, I'm like, there's too much ideological ambiguity, inconsistency, a lot of open to interpretation as to whether things are capitalist or socialist, and seems like things are we're very much in a era of revisionism again today. That was actually in the video. I should have meant to make some more of a critique about the video I played at the beginning. I did notice that they are, that's a Singaporean news outlet, and they're trying to insinuate that it's revisionism is on the table in the Vietnamese parliament there. But I guess it's not necessarily right for us to dispute that. Oh shit. All right. Looks like my mic got unplugged. I don't know how long that was unplugged for, but. All right. Okay. Yeah, it's like there's a lot of revisionism and accusations, and counter accusations of you're the revisionist. No, you're the revisionist. All the Western Marxists are revisionists. It's like, but isn't the whole thing about China liberalize, like Deng Xiaoping liberalizing the economy and turning away from some of the Mao era policies? Isn't that the whole revisionism right there? So I think we get a little bit of a purity with some of this, the anti-revisionist politics. Like, no one's more anti-revisionist than I am. It's kind of like a purity problem. So, and Cobra saying, oh, today all that remains is DPRK. That's the only communist state that exists. All others just have communism as like a patriotic pastime or something. This is the thing as far as analyzing the actual proletariat's relation to the means of production. So I would like to do more research on the DPRK too. I also would say that they're not as communist as they could be. They're more in like form of the way that they govern the country. They're more communist, but the way that they've got this, was it Kim Jong-il? I don't know how you pronounce the family in general, like the Il family, the Un family, the Kim family. Sorry, the Kim family is a dynasty. Okay, you can't have power to the people when there's one family is in charge of the government for generations. You turned it into a monarchy that's not a monarchy, monarchy not by name, but it is communist in a lot of other ways. And the fact that they have this blackout as far as information, you can't tell what's happening from the outside looking in because they've got this big internet censorship. I'm not comfortable with assuming that they're kind of what they claim to be, and I don't really feel I'm in a position to be able to acquire proof. So, but I do feel that they get a really bad rap. Nobody really understands North Korea. Like all the propaganda against it makes it so that people just assume that it's this ruthless dictatorship and whatnot. I feel like you can't confirm that because of the fucking Iron Curtain censorship. So where was I here? I wanted to play the Luna Oi video after reading that article there. And then we can read an article about the Sino-Soviet split that I found kind of tries to explain that from a non-biased, like tries to give you both sides. But it's probably written by some kind of Western academic, so... Oh no, it's a journal.rudn.ru, so I think it's written by Russian scholars. So anyway, before we get around to that article, I want to show you some Luna Oi. So these are some controversial things to be discussing about China's revolutionary character. And this happened in like 40 years ago, 45 years ago. So as relevant as it is to say China was bad for doing what they did at the time and just, be consistent about that, both the nations have, like, the reason why people say that both sides seem to have forgotten about it is because unlike a lot of other nations who are trying to use the past conflict that they've had with each other as a continued reason for bad blood and to hold over each other with a grudge, I think they've genuinely, both as communist nations trying to honestly be revolutionary in their own understanding of what that means, they have tried to bury the hatchet and move on. But that's as far as a distant outsider looking in, from what I can tell, based on people I've heard, like Luna here, describing the situation. So, Cobra is talking about North Korea. Normally I'd be against it, but their superstructure is absolutely communist, and they treat everything as still in a revolution against America. So I accept the military stronghold as a necessary evil, I guess. And Cobra says he thinks Vietnam has become a retirement home for Americans. I don't like that. Not cool. Yeah, if that's the case, that doesn't sound very cool. But they're trying to I think they're kind of doing the same sort of foreign policy as China here, where they're trying to do win-win foreign policy as far as like economic development. They want to be friends with the West, even though everyone knows that what's that cute saying? To be an enemy of the West is dangerous, but to be a friend of the West is fatal. So China and Vietnam are looking to disprove that common truism. So XD, what's up? He's saying, I think I remember this video. She emphasizes she doesn't want to hold it against China and promotes Sino-Viet solidarity, exactly like a comrade would. And then anti-communists watching, like learning this kind of stuff, they're like, oh, there you go, proof that communism fails and ends in blood every time, whatever. Even though, let's let her explain how much, like the CIA and them are ensuring this kind of situation happens. So here we go.
Hi everybody, I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna Ơi. This is part 2 in my series showing real stories from Vietnamese war veterans for the first time in English. In part 1, we focus on Vietnam's resistance war against the imperialist USA, started from 1950s to 1975. Today, we will hear stories from 1979 until 1989, during which time Vietnam had a border war with China and also fought to put an end to the genocidal communist regime in Cambodia. This chapter of Vietnamese history is almost unknown in the West. The border wars are hardly mentioned at all in the English-speaking sphere, and whenever they are mentioned, the information is usually from a Western perspective and almost always distorted and inaccurate. So now I will do my best to give you the story in detail about this very complicated period of time from our own perspective, including stories straight from the mouth of some of the people who were actually involved in the conflicts. Let's start by introducing Pol Pot, who took over the Communist Party of Cambodia and turned it into the communist regime. Side note, Cambodia is the Khmer name for Cambodia, so from now on, I will call Cambodia Cambodia. Pol Pot's real name was Saloth Sar, and he was born in 1925 to a rich farming family in Cambodia. Pol Pot was a Khmer nationalist who believed in the superiority of Khmer people over other people. In particular, he believed that Vietnamese peoples were ethnically inferior to Khmer peoples. It's very important to note that Pol Pot's nationalism is right-wing nationalism, totally and completely opposite to the left-wing nationalism of countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. If you find this confusing, I have a video explaining the difference between right-wing chauvinist nationalism and left-wing internationalist nationalism in the description. Anyway, Pol Pot traveled to Paris in the 1940s, where he joined the Communist Party of France. He came back to Cambodia in 1953 and joined the Khmer Viet Minh, a branch of the League for the Independence of Vietnam in Cambodia, which was led by Ho Chi Minh. Pol Pot then joined the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party in the late 50s and slowly gained more and more power. In 1962, Pol Pot assassinated Tho Samauth, the chairman of the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. Tho Samauth was considered the first victim of Pol Pot on his path to power. This assassination allowed Pol Pot to consolidate his power, and he immediately took over the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. Before Pol Pot's takeover, Cambodian and Vietnamese communists had a strong, close relationship, and there were high hopes for Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos uniting into a power bloc, which would make them the strongest political base in Southeast Asia, which would enable our countries to eliminate colonialism once and for all. Remember that Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos were all colonized by France, and France referred to our nations together as French Indochina. Our original Communist Party was even called the Communist Party of Indochina, so we had a very long history of working together going back decades. But once Pol Pot took power, he immediately kicked out every high-ranking member who supported Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. So right from day one of taking power, Pol Pot immediately turned his back on Vietnam and made us his enemy. In the late 60s, Pol Pot transformed his party into the Communist Party of Cambodia, aka the CPK. At that time, the CPK was very unpopular amongst the Cambodian people, and the CPK mostly hid in the jungle trying to recruit more members. During this time, Pol Pot seek help from China, Vietnam, and Laos. At the same time in Cambodia, Lon Nol, a general backed by the USA, was trying to coup Sihanouk, the king of Cambodia. The king wanted to take revenge against Lon Nol, and he saw Pol Pot as a useful ally. So he came to support Pol Pot, hoping that he would take down Lon Nol. Sihanouk was well known in Cambodia for his policy of staying neutral during the Vietnam War, while Lon Nol was openly an ally of the USA. The Cambodian people wanted to support Vietnam in the war and did not want to back the USA, so Lon Nol became very unpopular with the Cambodian people. Pol Pot took advantage of this and tried to build his popularity in the people of Cambodia by pretending to support Vietnam against the USA. Pol Pot even traveled to Vietnam in 1966 to meet with Ho Chi Minh, as well as Khe Son Phormaihan, the chairman of the Communist Party of Laos. And then,
I don't know if Luna's mentioned it at the beginning, but I need to do a little bit of the disclaimer about graphic content and like explicit discussions about like genocide and torture and awful traumatic things. So viewer discretion be advised.
There was some hope that Pol Pot would return to the alliance with Laos and Vietnam. This was a great propaganda for Pol Pot, as Cambodian communists were excited at the prospect of restoring an alliance. And Pol Pot used his new wave of popularity to build power against Lon Nol.
Jacqueline, was Pol Pot secretly backed by the CIA and MI6? He sounded exactly like the sort those two groups were back. He was, and this is one of the things that we also need to not forget, that Pol Pot was also backed by China, by Deng Xiaoping. Okay, so working with the CIA and MI6, to me, that kind of bankrupts your, with Kissinger and Deng Xiaoping, whatever, hand in hand, like helping Pol Pot do what he did, that bankrupts your revolutionary ideology or your rhetoric, right? I'm the most Marxist-Leninist that I can work with this kind of man, get out of here, right? But I'm that Western, buys well, right?
Unfortunately, Pol Pot quickly turned his back once more on Vietnam. From 1970 to 1973, while Vietnam was still fighting against USA occupation, Pol Pot and his army attacked Vietnamese Communist Army stations 174 times. Pol Pot's minions stole weapons and food and killed more than 600 Vietnamese soldiers during these raids. In 1973, when Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords with the USA, Pol Pot announced that it was a betrayal of Vietnam to the revolution of Indochina. And he organized protests to kick Vietnamese soldiers out of Cambodia, despite the fact that Cambodian communists had agreed to support Vietnam in our fight against imperialist USA back in the 50s and 60s. By 1975, Pol Pot had amassed enough of a following to overthrow Lon Nol in Phnom Penh. Pol Pot allowed King Sihanouk to become the head of the state of Cambodia after removing Lon Nol, but in name only, the king didn't really have any actual power. 1 year later, in 1976, the king resigned after seeing the direction which Pol Pot was taking Cambodia. After 1975, as Prime Minister, Pol Pot became the most powerful man in what came to be called Democratic Cambodia. This was also the time he officially changed his name from Salazar to Pol Pot. He also changed the name of the Communist Party of Cambodia to the Party of Democratic Cambodia, or the PDK, also infamously known as the Khmer Rouge. At this point, the Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot's leadership, started to purge and kill even more party members from East Cambodia who supported Vietnam. At first, Pol Pot and his party claimed to be Marxist-Leninists to gain support from Cambodian people, but right after he took power, he immediately betrayed all the values that he had claimed to uphold. Marxism-Leninism just became a cover which he cynically abused and abandoned as he perpetrated his crimes against humanity. Pol Pot's vision of socialism was not rooted in material conditions or class struggles to free the proletariat. It was more of a racially supremacist form of fascism, which sought to destroy all industry and eradicate all cities and force everyone to live in a primitive peasant lifestyle. One of the main principles of dialectical materialism, the underlying philosophy of Marxism-Leninism, is grounding our beliefs and actions in science and materialism. But Pol Pot's communists rejected science altogether, replacing it with superstition and pseudoscientific notions of Khmer supremacism over all other ethnicities. From 1975 to 1978, the Khmer Rouge continuously attacked the border of Vietnam from Ha Tien to Tây Ninh. He also launched attacks against Phu Quoc Island and Thổ Chu Island. Pol Pot's forces killed thousands of Vietnamese villagers, including women and children, while stealing hundreds of tons of rice, destroying our rice fields, and committing various other atrocities. Remember that this was right after our brutal war with the USA. We didn't have any time to recover, and now we were already facing a new threat right on our border.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. As far as why did China back Pol Pot, was China scared that an alliance between Vietnam and Cambodia would threaten China in some way? In a way, that's kind of what it was. It was this Sino-Soviet split that I was mentioning earlier. Vietnam ended up siding with Russia, and like Cambodia and Laos sided with China. And one thing that would have threatened Chinese influence would have been like you know how the Sahel states in West Africa have made an alliance. There are three nations of kind of unified, or they're beginning a direction towards a unification where eventually they could merge to become one country if this process continues uninterrupted. So there could have been, it seems like, very under-discussed possibility would have been like an Indo-China communist alliance state between Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which would have kind of made them a little bit more of an equal as far as China when it comes to economic and population demographics and those kinds of resources control. And so this whole thing about like greater, it's a bit of a tricky thing and nuance, because we see there's a thing about like right-wing expansionism would be like greater Israel, greater India, greater Russia, these kinds of things. The American technocrat, I don't know what you call it. What it was, I forget what it's. But there's this technate, the American technate. It was the idea that the U.S. and Canada and South America would become one massive country, right? So there's this imperialist, expansionist kind of model that we need to avoid. But then we can also maybe ask ourselves: is there kind of like a left-wing? I don't know what you would call it, like a federalist kind of, it appears to be expansionist, but it's more like reversing the balkanization, the divide and conquer that the imperialists try to impose on the regions of the world. So as far as arguments about nationalism, is it in Vietnam's interest to be an independent country and Cambodia's interest and Laos to be these smaller states? Or is it ultimately in their interest to think in a supranational kind of way, in a way that we, as working class, or whatever, the working class of the world, that's what we should unite. And so when we're thinking about in the narrow lens of nationalism, as we can unite on all kinds of ways, but we can't merge our national territories. That would erase our identities and whatnot. But it's kind of about transforming our identities with a conscious knowledge that everything is in constant motion and change, including how we see ourselves as people. And so one thing that we could do would be promote this federalization, or like Africa, for example, would be a massive counterweight to both China and America and Europe. If all of Africa was like the United States, it was the United African States. But instead, people try and push this nationalism, maybe because it's useful from the imperialist standpoint to keep people in that traditional, old-fashioned perception of human organization. So I don't know if that's a weird tangent for me, but hope that answered your question, Jack. Yeah, exactly. Right. It's we often like to talk about our strengths, not our weaknesses, our highs, not our lows, right? But if we actually want to overcome the contradictions that have set us back, that's the thing. Everyone wants to talk about solutions, right? But sometimes you gotta talk about the hard stuff before you can even understand what a solution's even going to be. So. Anyway, yeah. That's what I was saying. I had the same reaction when I learned about it, because it all happened way before I was born and everything, and it's all done, over and done with after the fact. But there's older people who like lived through it, still alive today. So when you learn about it, the younger generation, we look back at that as like as a young communist, I'm like, oh my God, how could they? What the fuck happened? But it's important to ask those questions to figure it out. So here we go.
It was during this time that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge revealed their true scheme. They wanted to restore the mighty empire of Angkor. The Angkor Empire used to be the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia from the 9th to 15th centuries. You may be wondering about what happened to the Angkor Empire. Most historians believe that around the year 1400, the Angkor Empire suffered two severe droughts. One
I just want to egg these things. I see most Western communists love to fault China more than the USSR. But I fault both of them. I fault the Americans more than anyone for working. Like people say that the capitalists don't work very hard, but the workers that they pay, their little CIA spies, they work very assiduously to ensure that everything is the worst outcome for humanity. Even though they maybe don't see that that's what they're doing. Like they're literally making sure that that progress is held back as long as possible. So, and I know a lot of people like really hate on this Khrushchev, but I think that part of the problem with both Mao and Stalin is that the way that they had, the types of leaders they had to be, because World War II was the kind of situation where, sorry if you're too much of a liberal, but we just can't have those kinds of human rights and freedoms in that kind of a global fight against fascism sort of thing. There's some kind of suspension of freedoms that's a necessary thing. But then they kind of lived through that for decades, and Stalin and Mao are a little bit too much of a hardline kind of authoritarian method, not reactionary, but like means to solve problems, wherever using authoritarian means as opposed to the more diplomatic. So there became like this necessary pendulum swing towards the more democratic, especially in order for communism to prove that it's not just fascism in red clothing, then we have to be like about some kind of, democratic, the will of the people. And so you can't suppress the people too much. But in war times, the problem with the way the Americans have been you need to read the history about how badly the Americans have manipulated the progress of everything, because you can't have a liberal kind of democratic response to that kind of infiltration. It's just utterly vulnerable to it. So, yeah. Here we go.
lasted for 30 years, and the next lasted for 20 years. This natural disaster terribly weakened the Angkor Empire and led to its total collapse in 1431. This history is important to understand if you want to know why Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge hated Vietnam so much. As an excuse for another attack against Vietnam in June 1977, Khmer Rouge leaders officially announced that Vietnam was #1 internal enemy of Cambodia. They blamed Vietnam for the collapse of the original Khmer Empire and invented a fake history in which we were mortal enemies, despite the fact that Vietnam never did any harm to Cambodia and that we had been strong allies and supported each other for decades against French colonialism and Western imperialism. But Pol Pot needed an excuse to attack Vietnam, which was very popular in Cambodia, as I explained before. So Pol Pot had to propagandize all sorts of anti-Vietnam lies. Pol Pot claimed that Vietnam wanted to end the existence of the Khmer people and create a new federation of Vietnam in Indochina.
The border problem is a very small problem. That is not important. The real problem is that Vietnam want to take possession of the whole Cambodia, to put Cambodia under his thumb.
This claim was completely baseless, but Pol Pot spread it viciously to stoke fear and hatred of Vietnamese people in Cambodia. The new government of Vietnam desperately tried to settle the situation and calm things down through diplomacy, because we were still reeling from decades of war against Japan, France, and the USA. The last thing we wanted was more war and conflict with Cambodia. Vietnam was still freshly devastated. We had just been bombed back to the Stone Age, and we were very tired of war. But the straw that broke the camel's back was the Ba Chuk massacre in 1978. On April 18th, the Khmer Rouge came to a village called Ba Chuk in An Giang province. They forced innocent villagers out of their houses and slaughtered them. In just one day, they murdered 3,157 villagers, most of whom were elders, women, and children. There were over 100 families that were completely wiped out in Ba Chuk. By July 1978, the Khmer Rouge had killed over 5,000 Vietnamese, injured another 5,000 more, and kidnapped more than 20,000 Vietnamese people to make them slaves in their labor camps. Thousands of schools, hospitals, medical centers, churches, and pagodas near the Cambodian border were destroyed. About 500,000 Vietnamese living near the border with Cambodia had to flee their homes further east to escape the raids of the Khmer Rouge.
Wow.
What's that? I just built a budgeting app and basically.
So now you know a little more about the crimes which the Khmer committed against Vietnam. But what about the Cambodian people who live under this genocidal regime? Under the leadership of Pol Pot, Cambodia went back to the Dark Ages. The Khmer wanted to build a primitive agriculture utopia where there would be no cities, no hospitals, no schools, no religion, no money, and no books. In the name of this mission, they forced millions of Cambodian people to leave cities to work on labor farms, which were essentially concentration camps. They forced intellectuals to marry uneducated people. They forced beautiful people to marry ugly people, and imposed many other eugenics and forced breeding programs on their own people with the belief that this would create a supreme generation of Khmer people.
I just have to say, any communist regime that's committing eugenics that claims to be communist, well, not a regime, I shouldn't say, that's the Western propaganda working its magic on me there. But any communist nation that does the eugenics and purports to be communist, that's one of the ways to tell that it's not. That's my view. Anyway.
Today you can go to the Museum of Khmer Crimes and see shocking evidence of these atrocities. It's one of the most disturbing places that I ever been in my life. In just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, Khmer killed over 2 million of their own Cambodian people, which was 25% of the whole Cambodia's population. In addition to this horrifying genocide, hundreds of thousands more Cambodians had to flee to Vietnam to escape. The Khmer was one of the most deadly and horrifying regimes in human history, and it's hard to explain just how evil they were. Many of the crimes committed by the Khmer I can't even tell you about on YouTube because this video would get restricted. But if you do some basic research, it's not hard to find the disgusting photographs and other evidence of these crimes. The crimes against humanity of the Khmer were so unspeakable that eventually the Cambodians finally rose up against them. On July 20, 1977, a 25-year-old soldier of the Khmer, Hun Sen, along with 4 soldiers, decided to desert from the Khmer and ran to Vietnam to look for help. 2 years later, in 1979, as an official answer to the call for help from the Cambodian people, as well as an answer to the mass murder of Vietnamese and Cambodian people, Vietnam officially sent an army to Cambodia to end the genocidal regime of the Khmer. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers volunteered to go fight for the freedom of the Cambodian people. It only took Vietnam a few months to kick Pol Pot out of the Cambodian government, but it took another 10 years for the Vietnam and Cambodia Liberation Army to completely defeat the Khmer and Pol Pot and set up a new government for Cambodia with Hun Sen as a new prime minister. According to the book Second Life, Second Death, The Khmer After 1978 by Kelvin Rowley, the Khmer officially renounced communism in 1981. There's a link to a PDF of the book in the description if you want to learn more. The important thing to understand is that Pol Pot was not a communist nor a Marxist-Leninist. He was a ruthless opportunist who took advantage of the popularity of communism and Marxist philosophy to build power for himself and commit horrible crimes which had nothing to do with the liberation of the working class whatsoever, just like so many fascists who came before and after him. And it was this communist Vietnam which liberated Cambodia and unseated the murderous Khmer regime. Now, with all this in mind, let's listen to the stories of Vietnamese volunteer soldiers who fought against the Khmer in Cambodia.
From 1969 to 1975, me and my unit had been fighting hundreds of battles together. I don't know how many of my comrades died. Many of their graves were lost. Many long nights I couldn't sleep. Their sacrifice was so great. War is the most heartrending, the most fierce loss and pain. After successfully defending our southwest borders, Vietnam's volunteer army, alongside the Revolutionary Armed Forces and people of Cambodia, defeated the reactionary army of Pol Pot and freed Phnom Penh. On January 7, 1979, we ended the genocidal regime Khmer Rouge. Bullets and bombs, much blood and bones of Vietnamese soldiers were shed on the land of our neighbor country to protect peace for the Cambodian people. There were many fierce fights. My unit fought together and died together. The love between the soldiers was very strong. When one died, the loss was great. As a soldier who personally joined the war, Colonel Win Chi could never forget the pain of losing his comrades in battle. For over 20 years, he and many comrades from K93 Martyr Remains Gathering Team of Anzang Province went through days of great hardship searching in the middle of the jungle. They found and brought back the remains of more than 3,300 Vietnamese martyrs in Cambodia. The sun, the rain, the storms, the worst time that we had gone through was stormy season. For a whole month long, my shirt was never dry. There was a day when we kept digging until it got dark and we found 7 comrades. Uncle Chi taught us that the remains of the Vietnamese martyrs were usually wrapped in a piece of rubber. When we were digging, whenever we heard the sound of the rubber cloth, suddenly all our weariness had gone.
So this video is pretty long to play the whole thing, but I think I'd like to do that anyway because I think it's important to give it a little bit more reach. And I could shorten it by skipping over some of these like testimonial videos that she's sharing, but that feels like it would be an insult to the memory of these men and women. So I think we're just gonna do a little bit of a history lesson today. So here we go.
With great effort in looking for the martyrs' remains in the summer this year, 41 martyrs were found and reunified with their comrades. This, to some extent, helped ease the pain of their comrades and family members.
Build a website you love with Wix.
We need to be determined, more determined to find and bring back the last of our martyrs.
Để tìm được cái người đó là cuối cùng nó đem về tổ quốc.
After watching this, you might ask, how could Pol Pot and the communists fight back for nearly a decade when they were so weak compared to Vietnam's volunteer army? Unfortunately, Pol Pot had some powerful friends. The communists was backed by China, the USA, the UK, Thailand, Singapore, and in the whole United Nations. This might sound shocking, but it's true.
And here we need to indict the United Nations once again, and to point out that from Cambodia to Gaza and everything that's happened in between, the UN has been a vile, complicit, useless at best organization. Just so you know fully the character of the UN, if anyone thinks that that's the solution to anything. I know the UN is in an existential crisis this year, kind of. They have a funding crisis because their funding model is, everything about the UN is intentionally flawed from the beginning, right? They have to pay money back to the member states, even if the member states haven't put in their dues, and the US has refused to pay its share of funding the UN. And that's how they've directly undermined it in order to continue committing genocide around the world. So the UN is useless. It was always from the beginning. Time to say that and be that. That needs to be the popular global opinion. We can't have false hope. Anyway, that's a digression.
I will show evidence here and also put links in the description where you can learn more and see for yourself. But you might be asking, why on earth did China, an ally of Vietnam in the Vietnam War, become the main supporter of the Khmer Rouge? And how did all of this affect Vietnam, the only country on earth that dared to stand up to Pol Pot to end the existence of his genocidal regime? Well, I will now try to answer that question from a Vietnamese perspective. But first, let me say this. I know for a fact that Westerners often try to use this history to drive a wedge between Chinese and Vietnamese communists.
Exactly this point right here. I know that there are opportunistic Westerners, CIA, capitalists, all kinds of fascists, right? All kinds of people have this intention And this comment kind of goes along with that. He studied it. Cobra says he studied it from both sides because, believe it or not, Pol Pot still has supporters today. It's wild and sad, and yes. And Bandera in Ukraine still has supporters today. Okay, and how does this happen? Because instead of having the respect for nations to teach their people in their schools and whatnot atrocities that need to never happen again, the CIA goes around cultivating these far right ideologies. Turkey is another excellent example. I watched a great documentary. I think it's from Beth D. Marks. If you never heard that channel, go subscribe. Talking about how the USA funded, the CIA propped up the Turkish fascists in order to defeat the communists, right? And this happens all over the world. It happens with Africa, with Patrice Lumumba and everything, right? So know your history, and you can't deny who's responsible for these all the bloodshed.
Yes. I also know that Westerners will try to clip out this video and take it out of context for me attacking China. This is something Westerners always do, which is why I usually tend to avoid talking about things like this on my channel. Because people in imperialist countries love to try to sow division and hatred between Asian communists. So let me just say, I am going to tell you the facts as I understand them. This is all history, and I hold no grudge against China over the history I'm about to tell you today. This all happened decades ago, and today, China and Vietnam are close partners, and China has done a lot to help Vietnam in recent history. So all that being said, let's begin. In order to answer this question, we have to look back further to the 1950s and 60s in Vietnam and the geopolitical relationship between China and the USSR at this time. When the USA occupied the south of Vietnam and established its puppet regime there, China was naturally worried for their own safety. The north of Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, had followed communism and thus became a perfect candidate for security buffer zone for China. Sort of how North Korea serves as a buffer between China and the USA-occupied South Korea. That was the main reason China supported North Vietnam. Another thing to understand is that both China and the Soviet Union wanted Vietnamese communists to slow down our fight for reunification in the 50s and 60s. Both Soviet and Chinese communists doubted that North Vietnam was strong enough to defeat the USA. And they were afraid that trying to liberate the south of Vietnam would fail and jeopardize communism throughout all of Vietnam.
So I would add there small, mild criticism of China, the Chinese historical Marxist-Leninists in both Soviet Union and China appear to have not had much faith in the smaller nations' ability to manifest a sustainable kind of communism in their nations. And I think that ended up being disastrous. I think China also supported the Thailand monarchy as opposed to the communists in Thailand. And there's a couple different examples like that I could probably point to if I do more research. But I think that the timeline that we're in now basically can be partly attributed to the failure of these larger nations, who got larger, by the way, because of the imperial territorial gains of imperialist China before it became communist and imperialist Russia before it became communist. And so what made them superpowers was because the territories that they inherited were acquired through imperial means. And then so then they had a bit of a hard time kind of justifying ideologically their right to be the leaders of the communist worldwide movement, in a sense where by having squabbles over that kind of thing at all, we ended up ensuring that it was not time for a global communist revolution. Although I felt like, based on the history I've seen so far, there was that Cold War situation. It was very possible for communism to have won already. We could all be living in a communist world, except for some of the, it's hard to admit where some of the successes of the imperialists, they were effective with their brutality, not so much their economic policy. It's always a disaster, their economics, but they know how to be brutal, that's for sure. And some of this fight fire with fire stuff we were talking about the other day, I think has demonstrated to be part of what keeps us trapped in a vicious cycle that ultimately benefits the imperialists, because we can't really, like, ideology becomes secondary when total war is all that we are allowed to have. So that's a good question, Jack. I have no idea. Maybe if Cobra's there still, if he might be able to answer that for you. But we're going to have to get to doing a case study on North Korea for sure, because we have yet to do that here on Noteworthy. So if you're appreciating what we're presenting here today, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And appreciate you either way for tuning in. So thank you.
So they apply a lot of pressure to try to get us to stop fighting and abandon the South. Vietnam refused these demands, and Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party of Vietnam stood their ground with the goal of reuniting North and South Vietnam as soon as possible. This required extremely careful and shrewd diplomacy on behalf of Vietnamese communists, who had to persuade both China and the USSR to continue to aid Vietnam while preserving our integrity and maintaining our original goal of uniting North and South Vietnam. Of course, it's only natural that the USA and other imperialist nations saw this as an opportunity to sow division and mistrust between China, the Soviet, and Vietnam, especially since China and the USSR were having conflict of their own during this time. In the 1960s in particular, the relationship between China and the USSR became worse and worse. This conflict hit with the border skirmish between the two nations in 1969. Vietnam was in a very uncomfortable situation because both China and the USSR were important allies and supporters in our war effort against the USA. In the end, Vietnam was forced to pick a side, and Vietnam decided to side with the USSR. This stoked tensions between Vietnam and China. Eventually, of course, Vietnam won our war against the USA and its puppet regime in the south of Vietnam, and we were able to reunite our country despite the doubts of the USSR and China. But this victory came with its own difficulties. China feared that Vietnam, allied with Cambodia and Laos, would become the next superpower in Asia, and that this would threaten the position of China, especially when Vietnam was backed by the enemies, the Soviets. So the rise of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and their intense hatred of Vietnam became the perfect poker card for China to use to keep Soviet-backed Southeast Asian communists from growing too powerful right on their border. The USA at this time was also still sour about their loss in the so-called Vietnam War, but they were also smart enough to not openly support the Khmer Rouge due to the crimes against humanity that they perpetuated against their own people. So they secretly encouraged China to buy the Khmer Rouge behind the scenes. Mao Zedong died in 1976 and Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978. Unfortunately, Deng Xiaoping was very hostile against Vietnam, and he decided to stop aiding Vietnam and redirected all that aid to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Up until the 1980s, 90% of weapons, money, and food sent to the Khmer Rouge came from China, while the other 10% came from the UK, Thailand, and Singapore, with all of this aid orchestrated by the USA, of course. The USA under President Jimmy Carter also wanted to see the USSR, of course, and came from weapons, money, and food Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Up until the 1980s, 90% of
Here's where it's kind of important to we maybe have a little bit of an issue where we blame everything on the USA. All the CIA backed the Khmer Rouge, and yet 90% of the weapons and money and food comes from China. So that's sounds like more support came from China than from the US. But this is where how much do we trust Deng Xiaoping? Because when his actions appear to be benefiting America more than China, it was apparently a deal with the devil that he made, because China is successful now at the expense of who, though? So the Deng Xiaoping, this guy in the picture here, I believe on the right. I got to do more research on him too, but he kind of ushered in this technocratic opening up, this globalization, this liberalization of the Chinese economy. You know, the Khrushchev to like the Chinese Khrushchev, you might say, if you want to be ultra critical of him. The way that Khrushchev sort of did the de-Stalinization Deng Xiaoping did a de-Maoization, you know, he did a little bit of the cultural revolution was a mistake. You know, you couldn't have said that until after Mao was out of power. And then when Khrushchev was in power, some of what Stalin did was a mistake. You know, the cult of Stalin needs to be taken apart. There does appear to be cult of personality around Stalin that was beneficial for making the Soviet Union the superpower it was, but psychologically in the long term for people, I think is unhealthy to cultivate the cult of personality of a leader. It's kind of ultimately, you might say, an anti-democratic thing. It's a patriarchal thing, often, most of the time, all these leaders have been men. And then it's a great man of history thing, as far as if you know what that is. That's more of like a bourgeois political theory thing. But it's ironic how a lot of communists have this nostalgic, great man of history kind of treatment of our leaders. It is more the anarchist type of mentality who says we should have no heroes. That's a dialectic I think is worth examining. You know, we do and do not need heroes, because I don't think it serves us to. It's hard to motivate the people to stand up and feel like that they are the revolutionary subject in history when we don't really celebrate people as heroes for doing that kind of thing. We just sort of the whole thing about treating communists only treat us all as we're all the same, and we eradicate individuality. Well, attacking the hero is a way to kind of make it sound like communism wants people to be the Borg. The reason why we're critical of hero worship is because there's a lot of reasons to be, you know, there's a lot of examples where hero worship has blinded a movement or led to its demise. You know, over-reliance on a figure that's ultimately transient, that's never going to be, like, we're all mortal. So, and then in order to try and, like, with the North Korea as an example, like when Kim Il-sung, the first one, the most revolutionary of the Kim family, the first, the grandfather, he's, I feel like, has the most respect of the three. And then the reason why you want to keep it in the bloodline is this thing about grave man theory of history, that you worry, for whatever reason, you shouldn't, that other members of the nation aren't quite as revolutionary as these great people who've already achieved greatness. And so it's that old divine mandate of heaven thing, right? The divine rule that if whatever, there's a lot of religious context behind that too, as far as the reason why this man is so powerful is because he's been gifted by God, kind of thing, to be our liberator. And that's kind of unexamined, I think. Okay, here, that's an interesting little footnote worth filing away. After Deng was leader, Jiang Zemin, I don't know, is responsible for most of the cheap labor to U.S. during the 90s. Right. So as much as China is, I think it's worth kind of like, not to be coming out critical of China, like credit where credit is due. They played the Americans, and the Americans were stupid enough to ship their means of production overseas, right? And they clearly benefited from that tactic, right? But they also benefited from the U.S.-led world order, right? So as much as you could say China's craftiness, it's also America's dominance that they managed to take advantage of. They allowed to take advantage, like, so there's some complicity there. Anyway, Kim Jong-un, yeah. I get their names mixed up. I have a hard time saying. Kim Jong-un is the first one. Kim Jong-il. No, Kim Jong, I don't know. Kim Jong, yeah, you tell me. Do you remember all three of them? So, because there's the one who fought in the Korean War. So what are you saying here? Kim Jong-un is the best. Nahilo, I want you to find a book by Kim Jong-un and read it. He was extremely revolutionary. It's no wonder America spent years making him seem crazy. All right, sure, yeah. On that Juche thing, because I have this concept I've developed called the tautological autarky. So when I look at Juche, it's a little bit too insistent about self-reliance, and that's like turning the economy of the country into a autarky, and historically that can be, an isolationist mindset is a little bit too limiting, and in my opinion, communism ultimately can only succeed if it's global, and so they're at a stage of development, and so Juche is good for surviving the American imperialism, but by no means the end-all be-all of ideological thought in Korea shouldn't be. Right? I don't think anyone who contest that either. I think they know that too, right? But Best Kim is Lil Kim. What's up, Bad Cookies? Good to see you. So Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un, and Kim Jong Il. I probably need to write that down, whatever, but because I'll try and hammer that in my memory, and I'll just mix them up anyway. So thank you for that, though. Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un, and Kim Jong Il. All right. Anyway, let's get back to this video because I have some other things I'd like to share. Depending on how long you guys want to go, we'll see how many of you stick with me, and I'll end up wrapping up if this ends up being boring for people. So, but I also want to. There's another video I have about. It's called Vietnam versus the U.S., the currency war you never heard about, and that's probably a good way to try and understand more contemporary China as far as, or Vietnam. What side are they on? How revolutionary are they still? They're still seen as like a threat by the U.S., and so they need to be kind of, the U.S. needs to try and use them or destroy them just like anyone else. So I think Vietnam is actually, compared to so many other countries, they're in good hands because they know the enemy, and they may be lucky to be so close to China in a sense, as long as China doesn't, turn imperialist. But anyway, back to the video.
Weapons, money, and food sent to the Khmer Rouge came from China, while the other 10% came from the UK, Thailand, and Singapore, with all of this aid orchestrated by the USA, of course. The USA under President Jimmy Carter also wanted to see the USSR and its allies weakened, and they saw China and Cambodia as useful temporary allies. Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter both met early in their respective administrations, and during their first meeting, Deng told Carter,
China must still teach Vietnam a lesson.
Deng then went to Japan to meet Prime Minister Masayoshi Ohira and said the same thing. So China under Deng was determined to undermine Vietnam, while building up the Khmer Rouge in an effort to check the USSR's influence in Southeast Asia. These official visits were all taking place as Vietnam was just beginning the military campaign into Cambodia to fight against the Khmer Rouge. And just 2 weeks after the official visit between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, on February 17, 1979, China sent an army of 300,000 soldiers and 400 tanks to attack the 1,400-kilometer border between China and Vietnam. This lasted 1 month with lost Vietnam side. On the night of March 9, 1979, the Chinese army went to a Vietnamese village near the border with China, Dong Troop Village. They captured and slaughtered 43 villagers with bayonets and bamboo sticks. All of the victims were women and children. The real intention behind these attacks was weakening and distracting Vietnam by forcing us to fight on two fronts at the same time. China under Deng was the biggest supporter of the Khmer Rouge, and it was believed that forcing Vietnam to withdraw a part of our army from the fight against the Khmer Rouge to defend against the Chinese invasion would be too much for Vietnam to handle. And it's true, Vietnam did have to move some forces from Cambodia to deal with the invasion from China. To justify the invasion of Vietnam, China claimed that Vietnam had provoked and bullied China first, and that their invasion was intended to teach Vietnam a lesson. But in fact, there was no justification for the invasion of Vietnam, and Vietnam was hardly in a position. Just after being devastated by decades of war with the USA, and while fighting a war with Cambodia to bully a superpower neighbor to the north. Another excuse for the attack on Vietnam by China was that Vietnam wanted to do ethnic cleansing of Chinese Hoa people in Vietnam in 1977, and therefore China invaded Vietnam to protect their own people. This is also a very insidious lie. The truth is,
well, I also have to point out upon hearing that there's an echo there that that we can see with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, although I feel like their claim is a bit more legitimate, that the Ukrainians really did want to systematically eliminate the Russian-speaking population. And in the Myanmar conflict, too, there's a question about how legitimate are the claims about the predominantly Buddhist Myanmar government, the way that they were persecuting the Rohingya Muslims. Is that a CIA narrative, or is that a genuine genocide? Because I see China and Russia are like openly militarily supporting Myanmar, and as far as people saying we need to stop genocide in Gaza, we need to actually know what we think about the Rohingya genocide, if that's what it is. And same thing with the Sudan genocide. There's actually a well-documented history of the imperialists trying to manufacture claims of genocide, and so they try to bury the real genocide and not let it into the history books or acknowledge it, and they want to invent genocide that didn't happen, like the Holodomor is like the most famous example, I would say. While there was a famine and many people had died at that time, the thing about genocide is intent. There's no evidence that it was intentional, and we have to understand about famines in history have been very common for these kinds of like droughts to wipe out millions of people, especially under monarchies. As far as people want to bring back monarchical rule, those kings and queens and emperors are the ones who were very much willing to let their subjects starve to death. And it was communist states who put an end to that. You know, it was both China and Russia had famines early on when they were consolidating power, and then once they implemented their communist economics, socioeconomics, and politics, they put an end to the famine. Needs to be said.
After 1975, Vietnam wanted to rebuild our country, and we wanted all Chinese people to take Vietnamese nationality and become an official ethnic minority of Vietnam. This would be the first time Chinese people were given citizenship in Vietnam, and with this new nationality, the ethnic Chinese would be given equal rights with all other Vietnamese, such as voting rights, the right to join the Communist Party, the right to become government workers, and so on. But many Chinese in Vietnam didn't want to take our nationality because they were afraid that they could be called to serve our military and they could be sent to Cambodia.
So that's tragic right there, because that was something that they were, had they not been at war, they would have likely been doing the right thing, and a lot of them would have happily accepted citizenship because it was something long due to them. And it has to be understood properly that China did that themselves in this instance then, because they're trying to be more of the real politics, the realist, as opposed to a Marxist-Leninist, I would say, because that's an ideology in and of itself. It's that Machiavellian kind of nihilism. The international politics is an anarchic struggle between imperial, like great powers and whatnot, and that kind of mentality, I don't think you can call Marxist-Leninist. You know, it's potentially diametrically opposed. We should debate that if anybody understands that stuff, wants to fill me in on it, whatever. But so as far as this nationalist kind of politics, you can't cry foul and clutch pearls about, oh, they're targeting our people or discriminating against our people, when you're creating conflicts that limit the opportunities of your diasporas in a way that you can then cynically exploit for geopolitical advantage or whatever.
Which I can totally understand, to be honest. To justify attacking Vietnam, Deng Xiaoping's agents began spreading another lie that Vietnam would kill all the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, which was obviously frightened to ethnic Chinese. This prompted about 160,000 ethnic Chinese in the north of Vietnam to flee back to China around 1978. There's a lot more to this story, but what's important to understand is that there was never any proof.
Sorry to pause the video so much, but XD's got a good question. You said today's stream is to talk about Vietnam. Are we talking about their recent deals with Israel? I did not look into that angle. So if you want to inform our audience about what these deals are, I would appreciate that. I was looking more into, because I did a segment on United Arab Emirates a couple videos, a couple of videos ago. Vietnam signed these comprehensive economic partnerships. As far as the last part of the title, the title of the video, Vietnam a viable strategic partner, apparently to the United Arab Emirates and the European Union. And Vietnam signed a trade deal with the U.S. and everything, elevating their. I think with Israel, did they do it with Israel too? They've elevated their relationships like a comprehensive strategic partnership, right? That's not how you treat people committing genocide, right? So in this case, we can be critical of Vietnam, saying that's not Marxist-Leninist. I think we should say, right? But then coming from the Western labor aristocracy, I get it. We can't really, like, we don't have a leg to stand on with that kind of a thing, but I don't know. Okay, hey, here we go.
Whatsoever that Vietnam was planning any sort of genocide against Chinese people, and in fact, no such genocide ever took place. These were all lies used by China to justify an unjust and unprompted invasion of Vietnam to weaken and distract our efforts against the communists in Cambodia. It's also very important to point out that Vietnam never forced anyone to go fight a war against Cambodia. All the soldiers who fought against Pol Pot were volunteers. It's also important to recognize that tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese Vietnamese bravely volunteered to join the Vietnamese army after 1975. To this day, there are around 750,000 Chinese Vietnamese living here in Vietnam, and they are an important part of our national community who have made many contributions to our economy, culture, and building our path to socialism. The short but very brutal border war between Vietnam and China caused more than 26,000 deaths of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. This began a very dark chapter of the relationship between Vietnam and China. In the 10 years from 1979 to 1989, there were a few more conflicts between the two countries. In 1989, when the remnants of the defeated army of communists were finally eliminated, the new Prime Minister Hun Sen's government became powerful enough to run the country, and Vietnam withdrew entirely from Cambodia. This was also when China stopped attacking its own border with Vietnam. Vietnam and China finally normalized our relationship in 1991 when Chiang Chai-min became the chairman of the People's Republic of China. I want to make it clear that Vietnamese people today hold no ill will towards Cambodia or China. This was a very unfortunate chapter of our history, and we really just want to close the door on it. While we never forget, we are very quick to forgive and move forward. Today, Vietnam trades more with China than with any other country. And China has made many important contributions to Vietnam, such as building our metro system in Hanoi, which I have made a video about. Link is in the description. But I think it's important to say that even though I think China's actions against Vietnam during this period were completely unjustified, I don't hold any grudges, and neither do most Vietnamese. We just hope that this can serve as a lesson for how terribly relations between communist nations can become, so we can avoid these kinds of conflicts in the future. So now let's listen to the memories of Vietnamese soldiers who fought in this Vietnam-Sino border war.
Looks like XD, I think you're saying you're not up to speed with the Vietnamese-Israel deal, or deals they may have. That's okay. I did do a brief, caught it with, like, we hear stuff and it sits in the back of our mind. We might not have time to follow up on it, so don't worry, that happens to me all the time. I caught it with something about a war museum for war heroes of Vietnam and Israel. Yeah, I think a lot of people didn't realize what kind of a monster they would be, just almost like the Epstein thing. People are now claiming they didn't realize how much of a monster they were involved with, or whatever. But it's too late. Where now you're stained historically by having any kind of like, the guilt of association is real sometimes, not just a fallacy. But here I have this is the article that came up with a simple search: Vietnam-Israel deal. February 3rd, 2026, Vietnam signs deal for Israel-made Firefly loitering munition. Reportedly signed an agreement with Rafael Advanced Defense System to equip the Vietnamese army with the MOAS drone known as the Spike Firefly loitering munition in a deal valued at approximately $250 million. So According to a report, the agreement includes the establishment of a production facility in Vietnam dedicating to manufacturing those systems. The facility will operate under a license issued by Rafael with technical know-how transferred from Israel. So there is Israel-made munitions. Yeah, that's not good. Some of that hypocrisy that makes it impossible for us to gain popularity for communism in the West, as far as blaming us for being too liberal or whatever, ultra leftist. It's impossible to get people to have a populist message in support of communism when we keep, every time we try, and we're not, like, for the past several years, we've been extremely anti-Zionist. That's kind of like the hill we're dying on, you might say. And there's no way we can pivot now to be in defense of those who are in such complicit, like, starve the regime economically with sanctions if you can't even go with them, right? At least stop buying weapons from them, giving them money so they can keep the genocide going, like facilitating their weapons industry. They use those weapons to kill the Gazans. But so this is where I think the Western communists have our strongest kind of point that we can make as far as Eastern Marxist criticism, right? Like who are you to call us hypocrites? If you guys, if you're saying like it's okay for us to be hypocrites and it's okay for you guys to be hypocrites, then we're all just, it's the race to the bottom of nihilistic, ultra conservative, like the neocon bullshit, right? Of the Kissinger era. We haven't exactly gotten out of the Kissinger era, you might say. We're still in it. Anyway, back to, we're almost finished here, I think, with this documentary.
There were 10 more martyrs found for a total number of 108 martyrs that were found by the gathering team of Ha Giang province over many years. In 10 years of the fight to defend our northern borders of our motherland, more than 4,000 Vietnamese soldiers died here. There are still 2,000 martyrs that have not been found in these Rocky Mountains on the border between Vietnam and China. Dear friends, 38 years ago, early in the morning, in campaign MB-84, our unit was assigned to take back latitude 712. Many of our comrades died right here on that day. I still remember the night 38 years ago. Everything was deadly quiet and pitch black. Regiment 876 had fought the battle on July 12th. 602 soldiers died that day. At that time, I was the youngest soldier of Battalion 3. I had just finished the 10th grade. I'd only been in the military for 4 months. In my battalion, I was the first one to shoot. At first, I was so scared, but then I saw my comrades getting injured and died, and all of that fear went away. With great effort in looking for the martyrs' remains in the summer of this year, our Regiment 2 also lost more than 200 soldiers here. After their Regiment 568 went up here and took our place, and at that time we lost 300 more soldiers, so in total, we lost more than 500 soldiers on the east side of the Low River. The two sides of the Low River are all one. They all belong to our beloved motherland, and we had to protect it. We are so proud that we successfully defended every single inch of our motherland. Brothers, we are standing on our motherland today. This is a victory. Yes, it is. After campaign MB-84, the fight to gain back our peaks in Vie Xuyen battlefield became more and more fierce. On January 19, 1985, in a fight to defend Peak 685, a soldier, before he died, left a vow carved on his gun. Martyr Nguyen Viet Ninh wrote, "Live by the rock to fight the enemy, die turning into immortal rocks." His words spread far and wide among our soldiers in the Vie Xuyen battlefield. Many soldiers leaned into the cliffs to fight and then died on those cliffs. The last words of Martyr Nguyen Viet Ninh became a message to all soldiers who fought for the motherland in Vie Xuyen.
Sông Bam Đa đánh đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời. Chốt biên cương đội hình bám đá tung hoành, thấu đêm vết thương khoảnh khắc tạm ngưng trận đánh. Vách chiến hào ghi chặt cây sung tâm tình, thao thức bên nhau khắc ghi tâm nguyện ngày xanh. Sông bám đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử, lời thề tuổi xuân nước Nam hào khí vọng vang. Sông bám đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời. Sông bám đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời.
My name is Vo Chan Chien. I'm a member of the Veteran Association in Mikhain Village, Hua Mi, Huanyon, Bindin. When the Southwest Border War happened, the division assigned me to Regiment 95. The battlefield in Cambodia was very fierce. I got injured in 1981, and now I live on welfare for veterans with 81% injury. Whenever there was a minute of silence, I immediately felt the value of peace. Many times a comrade was just sitting there, but a moment later he was gone. War means loss, sacrifice, and lots of blood.
Every old veteran who walked out of the war kept in their heart the memories of those fierce days. They don't just live for themselves, but also for the dreams of their comrades who died in the war.
I was lucky to be alive. I feel deeply sorry for all my comrades who sacrificed in the war. When we fight, we must fight to our last drop of blood, but I made a promise. If I got out alive, I would do whatever I can to help my people, to deserve the sacrifices of my comrades, to deserve to be called Uncle Ho's soldier.
Before ending my video, I want to talk a little about how other countries like the USA, the UK, Thailand, and Singapore, and even the whole United Nations have Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. First, let's talk about the USA. In 1981, the US National Security Consultant Zbigniew Brzezinski said,
I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. Pol Pot was an abomination. We could never support him, but China could.
It was revealed in a letter to a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. Congress that from 1980 to 1986, the U.S. secretly sent $85 million to Pol Pot. During the 80s, along the borders between Thailand and Cambodia, the CIA, along with some other U.S. organizations, set up a so-called refugee camps in a program called CARE to give aid to the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Two U.S. relief aid workers, Linda Mason and Rosa Brown, who worked at these camps, wrote,
The U.S. government insisted that the Khmer Rouge be fed. The U.S. preferred that the Khmer Rouge operation benefit from the credibility of an internationally known relief operation. In 1980, under U.S. pressure, the World Food Program handed over food worth $12 million to pass on to the Khmer Rouge. And that year, I traveled on a UN convoy of 40 trucks into Cambodia from Thailand and filmed a UN official handing the supplies over to a Khmer Rouge general, Nam Phan, known to Western aid officials as the Butcher. There is little doubt that without the support and the flow of arms from China through Thailand, the Khmer Rouge would have withered on the vine.
The CIA in May of 1980 denied that there had been any executions in the last 2 years of the Pol Pot regime. In fact, 500,000 innocent people were killed during that period. Even well after the killing fields were unearthed, the U.S. continued to legitimize the Khmer Rouge, voting at the UN Geneva Conference in 1981 to defeat an ASEAN proposal that the Khmer Rouge be disarmed.
So it is clear that the USA and China under Deng Xiaoping, despite the differences in ideology, shook hands with each other in secret to weaken Vietnam and the USSR, even if it meant supporting a brutal genocidal dictator like Pol Pot to do so.
I'm just going to say Red-Brown Alliance. because those accusations are often considered unfounded, but at least a temporary alliance on this particular issue, I would say that qualifies. Anyway.
The UK under Margaret Thatcher also played a hand in supporting Pol Pot. This remained a secret all the way up to 2000 when John Pilger, an Australian journalist, uncovered earlier work of Simon O'Dwyer Russell, another journalist who had a close connection with the Special Air Service, a special forces unit of the British Army. This reporting revealed the truth, as one SAS source was documented as saying,
"We first went to Thailand in 1984. Since then, we have worked in teams of 4 and 8 and have been attached to the Thai Army. The Yanks and us work together. We're close like brothers. We trained the Khmer Rouge in a lot of technical stuff, a lot about mines. We trained them in the Mark V rocket launchers and all sorts of weapons. We even gave them psychological training. At first, they wanted to go into the villages and just chop people up. We told them how to go easy. Some of us went up to 100 miles inside Cambodia with them on missions. There were about 250 of us on the border at any one time, and a lot of those would change sides given half the chance. That's how pissed off we are. We hate being mixed up with Pol Pot. I tell you, we are soldiers, not child murderers. It costs $500,000 to train one of us. Putting us in the service of a lunatic like Pol Pot makes no sense. There is no insurgency in Cambodia that threatens us."
Shout out to John Pilger, by the way. Rest in peace. And as far as those veterans who rightfully they make at least these historical statements of dissent, demonstrating that ultimately nobody wants this. We're all being driven to do this by a small handful of psychopaths we would all be well rid of,
O'Dwyer Russell died of a heart attack in 1990, a few years after these interviews, when he was just 29 years old. Margaret Thatcher and the British government have denied all of the evidence that has come out against them. But the records speak for themselves, and it's clear that Thatcher's administration supported the brutal atrocities of the Khmer Rouge, even against the advice of their own SAS officers. Thailand and Singapore also served as henchmen of the US and the UK by helping to deliver weapons and money to the Khmer Rouge, knowing fully that they were helping a genocidal regime, and Thailand even gave sanctuary to Pol Pot and other high-ranking members of the Khmer Rouge after they fled Cambodia. Throughout all the meetings at the United Nations during the 1980s and 90s, there were only 2 countries that openly supported Vietnam and criticized the crimes against humanity of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. These nations were the USSR and Czechoslovakia. The US, the UK, and their lapdogs kept voting to maintain the seat of the Democratic Kampuchea, aka the Khmer Rouge, in the United Nations. And the whole world took this as an excuse to comprehensively sanction Vietnam from 1978 until 2006, when Vietnam finally officially normalized relations with the USA. Finally, in 1997, with the agreement between Cambodia's new government and the United Nations, extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the ECCC, was formed. This is a special court which oversees justice against the Khmer Rouge and their crimes against humanity. 25 years later, on September 23, 2022, the last living leader of the Khmer Rouge, Khieu Samphan, received a life sentence from the ECCC. The genocide committed by the Khmer Rouge on its own people has now become well known all over the world. Nobody can deny Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge crimes against humanity. Not a single country that once sanctioned Vietnam for saving the Cambodian people has ever apologized for what they did.
And isn't that the recurring issue? The whole might makes right thing still kind of reigns. That
nobody can deny.
Not a single country ever apologizes for any of the genocides that they've committed or facilitated. That needs to stop.
Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge crimes against humanity. Not a single country that once sanctioned Vietnam for saving the Cambodian people has ever apologized for what they did. Instead, reactionaries have tried to revise history, blaming Pol Pot's crimes on communism, or to paint communism as an evil ideology. They conveniently forget that it was communist Vietnam that stopped the Khmer Rouge genocidal regime. And it was capitalism and imperialism that fed this regime and made it 100 times harder for Vietnamese and Cambodian people to save themselves.
And so the problem being that it would be much easier for us to categorically condemn this fascist, imperialist capitalism that led to this genocide, that insane psychopathic ideology that's been very clearly identified all over the world. and yet China had to be the one. 90% of the weapons had to come from China. So that's where the criticisms of China as imperialist kind of comes from, right? When you shake the hands of the people with blood on their hands, you also have blood on your hands. So not to be too critical on China, because this is history, like she was saying. I just see a lot of people they take away your communist credentials whenever you're not allowed to be a communist if you're critical about certain things. We're not allowed to talk about that kind of stuff, and that to me is anti-dialectical, and it is cancer to the communist movement. So like Cobra was saying, that's why real communist discipline is so important. So let's be realist enough to not be like naive victims of imperialism, but let's not be so realist that we end up feeling that we can cynically, opportunistically make deals with imperialists for our own gain, because it ends up being indefensible. So anyway, but this is the thing about Western communist principled stances are all we have, right? We're all talk and no action. So it's important for us, once we understand things, what side we're supposed to be on, that's when we're supposed to act. We're not just supposed to keep talking about it, right? You get the Caleb Maupin hat and have to wear it every day so folks know you're a clown. Yeah. And that's where I got to do this thing about I got to have actually I started my Substack thing, but I haven't written any articles yet. So I think maybe my first article I should write should be about the LaRoucheite influence on the Marxist-Leninists in the past, whatever, I don't know, since the death of LaRouche, we should say, because it's a very interesting, I think it's an unseen influence for the most part. All the young people following all these new channels, we're seeing all these different content creators like Danny Haifong and Caleb Maupin, and I don't know who else is it, like George Galloway. There's a lot of socialist figures who have made some tactical decisions to work with the LaRoucheites. Some of their, if you look on the LaRoucheite websites and stuff, you can see that they have had some kinds of publications or been they've gone to speaking events or something like that. And so then there's like Haz al-Din from the ACP or whatever. There's a couple different people you can connect to the LaRoucheites that are ostensibly Marxist-Leninists. And then you go look at the ironic history about the Soviet Union's position about LaRouche himself, and it seems to me like we've got ourselves an ideological threat as far as real communist discipline, right? They're gonna, as far as Vanguardism, another very important topic we have not been able to get to. Who's the real Vanguard? Because that's part of the question, my implicit question in the title of the video here. Is Vietnam a vanguard of communism, or is China the vanguard? Or is it wrong to say that one nation is the vanguard and the rest of the nations should follow it? I think the way that historically the ideology is written is that the vanguard party that gets the working class party into power, that is the vanguard, whether it's in China or Vietnam or anywhere else. Except when we have to kind of recognize with realism, whatever, or tempering our communism, we recognize that, well, are all vanguards equal? What if China or Vietnam may not be a vassal state of China, but it might be more at an economic disadvantage just because of, sheer numbers and geographical territory. Like there are people who are like, that's from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That's the way to understand that kind of thing, right? Like raise up the smaller powers as opposed to dominating them, but that's not necessarily what happens in practice. So yeah, Jose Vega, that's what I'm saying. So I'm gonna do my best to make that article for you guys, and then we'll have a conversation about that, because we all want friends, and as a weakened movement, we need to grow. We're looking for people who we're not being too critical about. Like we need to have an open door policy to some degree, but then we can't It can't be we can't just let in anybody and everything. Like, you know, I'm not even in anything. I can't even talk like that, right? I'm already not being let in because of the need for strictness of not letting people in. But I find that they've let in the wrong people, and the LaRouchites are gatekeeping people, more earnest people who want to actually do what they can to literally be a revolutionary as opposed to cosplaying. But it's hard to do, actually, maybe. So, especially if you're not getting support, and then you run into this problem. So that's the end of that video. Check out Luna Oi if you haven't. So I have another video that I was going to share. It's also pretty long though, and we're already 2 hours in. Be critical about everything, but damn it, we have to work together to stop G.I. Joe. I mean, look at history. Exactly. So as much as the Trotskyists and whatnot have been infiltrated by the CIA or are constantly wrong about everything, whatever, the more that we just let communist history be like a 100-year struggle between Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists and Maoists and whoever else wants to start a new cult of personality, like we're going in circles. We're not getting anywhere. So let me see here what. So one thing to mention as far as the continuity of Chinese imperialism is the South China Sea. So there's this whole big, like, I think it's UNCLOS, UNCLOS, the United Nations, whatever thing about the rights at sea. And so China's got this like a much larger claim to territory in the sea than any other nation, any other territory. Like the fact that they have a territorial dispute between China and Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam, and China's like hundreds of kilometers away, is a little bit suspicious. And I think that China feels that they're very justified in like historically the islands belong to them because they were the ones who colonized the islands first. But this is the thing about it's a difficult thing for it's a past that they have to not talk about for them to behave like this. Is my ironic comparison is these islands were promised to me over 2,000 years ago, bro. I know that's a very petty false equivalence, but I'm just saying, right? Because they were those territories were acquired in China's imperialistic phase, okay? And so then now China, because they gain the benefit of maintaining the territory that was gained through ill-gotten means, now they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be the revolutionary, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist superpower that secret to their success was the colonialism and imperialism is how they got that power to begin with. Okay, so I think we need to sort of, how should I put it? You don't want to let them get away with that kind of thing. You gotta, like, yes, you can still be the anti-imperialist fighting the Americans, doing the whole de-dollarization thing. That's not false in any way, but there are some claims where you can be skeptical and say, yeah, but you're kind of not really what you say you are. Like when they could probably let the other nations have these resources and they would be fine because they already have massive amounts of more resources than anyone else anyway. But that's not how it works when you're trying to just, maintain power, as much power as possible. So, but ironically enough, I was reading something that said before the Chinese communists won the civil war against the Kuomintang, in the first constitution that Mao and them had written, that they had promised that these territories that the imperial China had gained would be allowed to have the self-determination to choose to be with China or not. And then they conveniently took that out after 1949 when they took power. Then they went they went back on their promise in a way. And I see a historical parallel there with Ukraine, as far as Russia went the other route. Like the USSR made it so that legally, part of the reason why you might argue that the union dissolved was that it was legally, it was not binding or whatever. They were allowed to leave if they wanted to, and China chose not to have that kind of a liberal policy. You might say they were more authoritarian in that they were saying, like Tibet and the East, whatever, Turkmenistan, whatever, the Uyghurs' homeland, that they're not allowed to have self-determination, right? Including these islands in the South China Sea, right? So it's all very interesting. The contradictions need to be analyzed there. And I'm not saying I understand what's right, the right position to have on it, but these are nuances that help you understand why people are maybe confused about China. So, but then the other thing about the international law, about the UN stuff, we just exposed how useless the UN is, right? But now we're trying to enforce the UN laws about how the territorial waters, coastal waters are supposed to be treated and whatnot. And then China has ratified this treaty, but now they're kind of not being in compliance with it. They're just ignoring a law that they said they were going to comply with. The US, on the other hand, refused to ratify this UNCLOS law of the sea thing. And so it seems like the great powers have, and they use their UN, the veto on the Security Council to make sure that there are no actual solutions to these, no diplomatic solutions anyways. So there's some hypocrisy on both sides. I don't know if I want to take the time to read this stuff. Let me just play some of this video here, this next video. I don't know if I'll get through all of it, but I want people to recognize, we want to keep it on Vietnam, because we could talk about China every day, just like we could talk about this guy here every day. But let me show you a little bit, something probably more recent history that you didn't really know about at all.
2020. In the final weeks of the Trump administration, the United States Department of the Treasury dropped an economic and diplomatic bombshell. In its semi-annual report on the foreign exchange policies of major trading partners, it officially designated 2 countries as currency manipulators.
I realized that was a really bad segue. I just fucking was talking about one thing totally separate from this, and I just randomly, oh yeah, but anyway, I'm gonna do this now. But so this is, let me give a little bit more preface before we just jump into it harshly like that. This video is from August 8th, 2025. The United States once labeled Vietnam a currency manipulator. And so there was kind of like this trade war stuff's been going on since before the whole tariff war launched again. And I think here is here's the article headline I should share with you first, whatever. So Vietnam and the United States have reached an agreement over charges of currency manipulation. I'm trying to find out when is this article written. And I don't like, sometimes the article doesn't really give you a date. But anyway, on October 2nd, October 2020, the Office of the United States Trade Representative under Trump's administration initiated an investigation regarding Vietnam's acts, policies, and practices related to the valuation of its currency, blah, 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 blah. Asserted that the government of Vietnam, through the state bank, tightly manages the value of its currency. So basically, they're accusing them of the U.S., which is the greatest currency manipulator in the world, right? Biggest hypocrite of all time, stated that Vietnam gained unfair competitive advantage in international trade by manipulating its currency. So they had this dispute like 5-6 years ago now here, and then they resolved it over the past, like this is as far as the U.S. like strong arms people into being their allies, whether they like it or not. So, but the irony is, it's kind of revealed that when you're looking at that history about the war and stuff, or the wars that Vietnam was fighting, it's pretty brutal to accuse them of currency manipulation when countries that need to repair themselves after wars or several brutal wars, where you're going to need to kind of manipulate the currency, whatever, in order to give it life again. And that's just something that people don't understand or whatever. I don't know what to tell you. Like, but here, let's get this. So now that I've kind of prefaced that a little bit better, let me play this, because now this is like a maybe important little bit of like the necessary historical materialism to understand why what is it? Vietnam is making trade deals with the U.S. right after having like this currency manipulation legal battle. They're trying to sign deals so that they can get out of like a constant state of economic lawfare kind of with the U.S. right? Not that they're trying to be their allies or their vassal. They're just trying to like get back to some kind of normalized relation so that they're not in like such a target, I guess, so that they can carry forward as a member of BRICS and stuff. So this is all to be continued. Vietnam guys promising 10% growth this year, and I feel like it's the U.S.'s mission to make sure that doesn't happen.
On December 16th, 2020, in the final weeks of the Trump administration, the United States Department of the Treasury dropped an economic and diplomatic bombshell. In its semi-annual report on the foreign exchange policies of major trading partners, it officially designated two countries as currency manipulators, Switzerland and Vietnam. For Switzerland, a wealthy, stable economy, the label was perplexing. But for...
That's interesting too. We got to talk about Switzerland one day. That little fucking country that's always got its fingers in shit. They're like Canada and Israel or whatever. Like they're always in the same camp with the U.S., but they somehow get treated like they're neutral. Not like, that's a bad example saying it like Canada and Israel, because they're not so much neutral. They're like, but somehow, unlike them, Switzerland gets to be painted like they're neutral. Like, but they are like the bankers of the Nazis, always have been. Okay. Anyway, to put them in the category with Vietnam is quite the ironic juxtaposition. Anyway.
Vietnam, it was a profound shock. The designation placed Hanoi in the same penalty box that Beijing had occupied just a year earlier, threatening a trade war with a country the US was actively courting as a cornerstone of its Indo-Pacific strategy. The move was a startling contradiction. For years, Washington had been methodically strengthening its ties with Hanoi, viewing the rapidly growing nation as a critical partner and a vital counterweight to China's expanding influence in Southeast Asia. The two former enemies had normalized relations in 1995, signed a pivotal bilateral trade agreement in 2000, and elevated their relationship to a comprehensive partnership in 2013. By 2020, high-level diplomatic and military exchanges were routine, and US strategy documents explicitly identified Vietnam as an emerging security partner. This brings us to the central question of this story. Why would the United States risk derailing its relationship with one of its most important strategic partners in Asia over a technical currency dispute? The answer is not simple. It lies at the complex intersection of rigid American trade law, the unintended consequences of a global trade war, and the delicate diplomatic dance between a superpower and a rising middle power.
So this video, I think I was maybe more free to just let Luna's video play, because she's a comrade. I'm guessing she wouldn't like copyright strike me. Hopefully, I want to share her content, right? I think she gets that. This kind of video, I got no idea who this guy is so much. Let me see.
This was not a pre-med.
Sorry. This is Behind Asia. So these bigger 436K subscribers, these people tend to be capitalists and stuff. So I have no idea who these people are. But I'm just saying they'll probably strike me. I need to pause it and make comments more often to act, because the free use policy. Let me put my banner up. Your fair use disclaimer. We intend to comment and critique on this video. We're not just content sniping or whatever you call it. Anyway.
Meditated attack on a partner, but rather the logical, almost automated outcome of a collision between two powerful and opposing forces. On one side was Vietnam's explosive, export-led economic growth, which had been supercharged by the very US trade war against China. On the other was a rigid, criteria-driven US trade enforcement policy that, under the America First doctrine, was designed to be blind to geopolitical nuance. The crisis was, in essence, a friendly fire incident waiting to happen.
That's why I apologize. I'm making such a long stream, playing so many long videos back to back, but I feel like this is important to share. Because why are we doing this? Or why are they doing this? Like, why are communists thinking like it's okay? Well, I guess to justify it is necessary at this point. But is it? Is it really?
Happen. A direct and predictable consequence of one American policy, creating the very conditions for another American policy to be triggered against a key ally. To understand how Vietnam ended up in Washington's crosshairs, one must first understand its remarkable economic trajectory. After the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the country was economically devastated and internationally isolated. For over a decade, it languished under a centrally planned system that stifled growth. The turning point came in 1986 with the launch of the Choi Moi, or renovation, reforms. This was a fundamental pivot away from central planning and toward a socialist-oriented market economy. The Choi Moi reforms unleashed the Vietnamese economy. The government decentralized control, encouraged private enterprise, and critically began opening the country to the world. A key reform was the 1993 land law, which granted land use rights that could be traded and inherited, boosting agricultural productivity. But the most transformative element was the embrace of foreign trade and investment. Vietnam actively pursued an export-led growth, ELG model, a strategy that had previously fueled the rise of the East Asian miracle economies like South Korea and Taiwan. The core idea of ELG is that by producing for global markets, a country can achieve greater efficiency, absorb modern technology, and stimulate a virtuous cycle of growth. Foreign direct investment, FDI, was the engine of this model. Vietnam rolled out the welcome mat for international corporations, offering tax incentives and developing industrial zones. The results were staggering. Giants like Samsung, LG, and Intel set up massive manufacturing operations, transforming Vietnam into a global production hub for electronics, textiles, apparel, and footwear. By 2022, FDI-backed companies accounted for over 70% of Vietnam's total export revenues. This strategy made Vietnam's economy one of the most open in the world. By 2020, its trade-to-GDP ratio had surpassed an astonishing 160%. This success earned it the moniker Asia's other miracle, but its deep integration into global supply chains was both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability.
This kind of integration is not sustainable over decades. Like that, as important as a boost that's going to be, it's actually really necessary for like a post-war recovery kind of thing. But eventually, they're going to need to come to terms with slower growth, which is more rational, and that's maybe. If you sustain these kinds of massive numbers for too long, it's going to be hard for people to get used to normal growth again. But I don't know how important of a critique that is. So.
Geopolitical landscape of the late 2010s provided a massive, unexpected accelerant to Vietnam's economic engine, the US-China trade war. Beginning in 2018, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. In response, multinational companies scrambled to move their supply chains out of China to avoid the new taxes. This phenomenon, known as trade diversion, created a geopolitical windfall for Vietnam. Due to its geographical proximity to China, competitive labor costs, and established manufacturing infrastructure, Vietnam became the primary beneficiary of this corporate exodus. Companies could jump the tariff wall by shifting final assembly of their products to Vietnam before exporting them to the United States. The data reveals a clear pattern. As US tariffs on China took effect, Chinese exports of intermediate goods and components to Vietnam surged. Simultaneously, Vietnam's exports of finished goods to the United States skyrocketed. For example, in 2019, US imports from Vietnam jumped by over 35%, while imports from China fell. This shift directly fueled the explosion in Vietnam's bilateral trade surplus with the United States, the central irritant in the currency dispute. The very success that made Vietnam a poster child for supply chain diversification also painted a target on its back. The US-China trade war created a bizarre paradox for Vietnam. It was a massive economic boon, accelerating its rise as a manufacturing powerhouse and cementing its importance as a strategic alternative to China. Yet this very success, measured in the cold, hard numbers of a bilateral trade balance, made it a prime target for the US Treasury's narrow, deficit-focused enforcement regime. The policy designed to counter China inadvertently created the statistical evidence used to punish a key partner in that same anti-China strategy. Vietnam was caught in a friendly fire incident, a casualty of its own success. The widening trade gap was impossible to ignore. A look at the bilateral goods trade balance in the years leading up to the designation shows.
I'd say not just the capital, not just a victim of its own success, but that's the classic, like, Marx is right, or that's how capitalist economics work. Wherever the more successful your capitalism is, wherever the more you liberalize yourself to this globalized capitalist economy, the more the contradictions of capitalism will eventually turn around and boomerang and bite you in the fucking face. Anyway.
Shows an unmistakable trend. As the table clearly shows, the deficit ballooned by over 40% in 2019 alone, the first full year of the trade war's effects. It was this dramatic surge that set off alarm bells in Washington and put the US and Vietnam on a collision course.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it.
Oh, fuck you, ads. This is where, if you've never been your own ad blocker, it's actually faster than waiting for the skip button.
The Treasury Department's decision to label Vietnam a currency manipulator was not arbitrary. It was the result of a methodical, if rigid, application of US law. The designation was based on two key statutes: the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which gives the Treasury broad authority to analyze currency practices, and more specifically, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015. The 2015 Act was crucial because it established three specific quantitative criteria that, if met, would automatically trigger enhanced analysis and could lead to a manipulator designation. The 2015 Act was designed to take the guesswork out of identifying unfair currency practices by creating a simple, data-driven checklist. To be flagged for potential manipulation, a country had to meet all three of the following criteria over a 12-month period. A significant bilateral trade surplus with the United States. At the time, this was defined as a goods surplus of at least $20 billion. A material global current account surplus.
This is where it gets a little bit technical. I don't know if people falling asleep a little bit when they're learning about economic terminology and whatnot, but it's kind of important to learn how this stuff works, or at least the rhetoric they use to justify imposing harsh bullshit measures. This is how they pretend that someone's a currency manipulator, right? The Americans, anyway. You could see maybe, like, on the surface logic level, it kind of makes sense, but then in practice, the guy will explain how in practice it doesn't really work very well to identify who is or is not a currency manipulator, which, oh, I'm shocked, as if that wasn't the point. When the US, with their global currency reserve, every time anything is a threat to them, they weaponize the dollar and they manipulate their currency. So don't let the boy who cried wolf, but it's not even the boy, it's the wolf who cried wolf, right? Anyway.
The threshold for this was a surplus equivalent to at least 2% of the country's gross domestic product, GDP. The current account is the broadest measure of a country's trade, including not just goods, but also services and financial transfers.
Let me go back a little bit, because Sean asking a question. So we said you have to owe us minimum 20 billion, or that they have 20 billion over us. So it says, defined as a 1-year U.S. census-based goods trade surplus of at least $2 billion. So if you're making $20 billion off of your trade with us, I think is a way to say it. Maybe correct me if someone understands that better than me, but I'm saying the U.S. wants, in a way, it wants these trade surpluses. It wants everyone else to be the manufacturer of the world just so that it can use financial domination. That's really what their strategy has been for the last who knows how long. But now even though that's what they want, they pretend like that's a problem to them. So because Vietnam exports more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to Vietnam, which is the trade surplus, whatever. Yeah.
A material global current account surplus. The threshold for this was a surplus equivalent to at least 2% of the country's gross domestic product, GDP. The current...
And Jack's got another good question. So this is a conclusion I find it hard not to draw. It might be that people would have a hard time saying, yes, that is what it appears that they've done, because of the need for loyalty, to not say the quiet part out loud, whatever, to the damage, the collateral damage that could be done by having to admit, or maybe it's not admitting. That's what I'm saying. If unless they can justify this in a way that's believable, or not just believable, but is objectively more like is objectively accurate kind of thing. But it's that rock in the hard place, because the reason why China felt the need to open up and Vietnam felt the need to open up is that this decentralized economy, everyone's criticized, one of the main criticisms of the communist system is that when they centralize the system too much and they get too isolationist, then they suffer, they lose the ability to innovate and whatnot. They stagnate economically and stuff like this. I think part of what people are not understanding with that critique is that when you it's not being able to think outside of the capitalist box. So the only way we measure economies are according to liberal capitalist economics, literally. So when you build your economy in a fundamentally different way, you cannot use those measures to measure the success or failure of your system. But that's what the West does anyway. So, and I think a lot of communists end up doing that too. We use measures like GDP and stuff like that, and then we worry about inflation and everything as if it matters in the first place. But that's the thing. If we're actually really wrong about that not being important, that would be a disaster to try and build a system that doesn't incorporate those things. I think it's us falling for it just because we can't measure it in the capitalist sense that it's not successful or whatever. But I think that it is successful or whatever, and it's this trap that but that's what maybe would make me a Maoist or whatever, in a sense, because it's I think that instead of opening up to the West, they probably should have just figured out how to do the Maoist economics better, whatever, make it work properly. And what they did instead was potentially fatal as far as abandoning, betraying the communist ideology. These things are actually really complicated, and I don't really blame people for not having all the answers. This is why we need actual respect for academics and intellectuals, because those are the people. This is their wheelhouse. That's their field of study. That's their contribution to the working class, right? Some people do their work with hammers. Some people do their work with a ladle. Some people do their work with a pen, right? And it's all valued, all valued by all very necessary for the revolution. So, hope I answered your question. I think to answer it for my own self, to be continued a little bit. I'm not, in a way, I feel like they've maybe for the time being, they've made pragmatic compromises that, if are allowed to continue, will eventually be fatal and be permanent. But they have the opportunity to, there can be a bit of a ebb and flow, you might say, unnecessary, a dialectical give and take with capitalism in order to try and overcome it, in a way, to try and not overcome it all at once too fast or whatever and exhaust yourself, or you have to learn how to fight your battles, in a sense. So I think for now they're waiting for their opportunity to be to implement a more communist way of economics, or whatever. That's what they're trying to do with the de-dollarization. Once that's finally accomplished, they don't have to kind of play by America's rules anymore. But for the meantime, they gotta kind of appear to give the U.S. what they want in order to get away with what they're going to do that will ultimately put the Americans in their place. But it's all to be seen. We're waiting for, I think it's going to be until 2030, 2045 till we're really going to see definitively what's happened once and for all, whatever. I don't know. I don't like to make too many predictions too far in the future. So.
The count is the broadest measure of a country's trade, including not just goods, but also services and financial transfers. Persistent, one-sided foreign exchange, FX, intervention. This meant the country's central bank was consistently buying foreign currency, usually US dollars, to keep its own currency from appreciating. The specific test was net purchases of foreign currency, totaling at least 2% of GDP over at least 6 of the 12 months. This three-part test created a clear, if inflexible, tripwire. For the Trump administration, which viewed large trade deficits as a sign of cheating, it was a powerful tool to pressure trading partners. In its December 2020 report, the Treasury Department laid out its case, meticulously documenting how Vietnam, for the 4 quarters ending in June 2020, had tripped all 3 wires. First, the bilateral trade surplus. As a direct result of the trade diversion from China, Vietnam's goods trade surplus with the US reached $58 billion during the period under review. This was nearly 3 times the $20 billion threshold, making it an easy and undeniable first strike. Second, the global current account surplus. Vietnam's overall current account surplus stood at 4.6% of its GDP. This was more than double the 2% threshold, ticking the second box. While economists might debate the significance of this figure for a developing country, it unequivocally met the statutory test. Third, and most contentiously, was the foreign exchange intervention. The Treasury found that the State Bank of Vietnam, SBV, had engaged in large-scale, protracted intervention to prevent the Vietnamese dong from strengthening. Its net purchases of foreign currency amounted to an estimated 5.1% of GDP, blowing past the 2% threshold. This was the smoking gun for the Treasury, as it appeared to be direct action to hold down the currency's value. From a purely legalistic and mechanical perspective, the case was closed. Vietnam had met all 3 criteria laid out in the 2015 law. The Treasury report concluded that at least part of Vietnam's exchange rate management was for the purpose of preventing effective balance of payments adjustments and gaining unfair competitive advantage in international trade. The Treasury's designation, while damaging, was not the only threat facing Vietnam. An even more immediate danger came from a parallel investigation launched in October 2020 by the Office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Section 301 is a powerful and controversial tool that allows the US president to impose unilateral tariffs or other trade restrictions on any country whose trade practices are deemed unreasonable or discriminatory and burden US commerce. It was the same authority.
And that's where I have my little different definition of authoritarianism that I was talking about a few times now. But yeah, last week, whatever, or on Tuesday or whatever it was. This is what I'm talking about. It is a law called Section 301 that they legislated that they now use as their legal bludgeon, their excuse to impose these what should be considered like collective punishment, like a war crime kind of thing, but it's economic. So instead of like kinetic war, even though we know that economic sanctions actually can kill more people than dropping physical bombs on people, which is something I wish people would wake up on. As far as it's called economic war for a reason. It's called psychological war for a reason. It needs to be made just as illegal, right? But it's treated like it's fair game. So the idea that business is war can go fuck itself.
Used to launch the trade war with China. The USTR investigation focused specifically on whether Vietnam's currency practices were actionable under Section 301. On January 15, 2021, just days before the end of the Trump administration, USTR released its findings. It concluded that Vietnam's currency policies were indeed unreasonable and burden or restrict US commerce, providing the legal justification for imposing punitive tariffs. However, in a crucial move, USTR announced it would not take any specific action at that time, effectively handing the hot potato to the incoming Biden administration. This decision created a moment of intense uncertainty. The legal groundwork for a trade war had been laid, and the fuse was lit. Whether it would be extinguished or allowed to detonate would depend entirely on the priorities of the new team in the White House. While the technical case against Vietnam appeared straightforward, it rested on a narrow interpretation of data that ignored both the country's specific circumstances and the broader economic context. The designation immediately drew a sharp rebuttal from Hanoi and trenchant criticism from independent economists, who argued that the Treasury's verdict was a classic case of misdiagnosing the problem. The State Bank of Vietnam, SBV, moved swiftly to reject the currency manipulator label. In a series of statements, Vietnamese officials consistently denied that their policies were designed to create an unfair trade advantage. Their defense rested on 2 core arguments, which they maintained were the legitimate and primary goals of their monetary policy. First, the SBV asserted that its management of the exchange rate was aimed at achieving domestic macroeconomic stability, a core mandate for any central bank. For a rapidly growing and transforming economy like Vietnam's, preventing wild swings in the currency is crucial for controlling inflation, ensuring financial stability, and providing a predictable environment for investment. They argued that a stable dong, pegged loosely to the US dollar, was a necessary anchor for their economy, not a tool for trade predation. Second, the SBV addressed the large-scale foreign currency purchases directly. They argued that these interventions were not meant to suppress the dong's value for competitive gain, but rather to build up the country's critically low foreign exchange reserves.
So I find it interesting that they're talking about. Let me rewind it a little bit here. But they're talking about the need for a loosely pegged to the dollar system, as like it's ironic that the Americans are attacking them, saying that you're manipulating your currency when they've decided to peg their currency to the dollar, however loosely or not, right? Because that's one of my criticisms of Saudi Arabia and the UAE with their allegedly ostensible de-dollarization and BRICS activity. But if your country's currency is still pegged to the American dollar, aren't you propping up the U.S. hegemony? And so how is that really? I don't know if that makes logical sense. It reveals the contradiction in the Americans' argument that they're manipulating their currency for unfair trade advantage when they're doing it out of necessity because of the Americans' the dollar primacy, you know. So, because if they didn't do that, in a sense, that's what I'm saying. It would, like, they have an obligation to do stuff like that, because otherwise you shoot yourself in the foot by not running the race like everyone else, I guess. I don't know. Kind of good. I don't know what metaphor is suitable there, but here we go.
Not a tool for trade predation. Second, the SBV addressed the large-scale foreign currency purchases directly. They argued that these interventions were not meant to suppress the dong's value for competitive gain, but rather to build up the country's critically low foreign exchange reserves. Compared to its...
And here's another point as far as the, like, that was then and this is now. Now we're in the period where there's all kinds of countries that are dropping their U.S. treasuries. They're getting rid of the U.S. bonds or whatever. Like, they're getting rid of their foreign exchange reserves, and that's fucking America over. And so the shoe's on the other foot now. They were complaining with Vietnam that they're buying up too many foreign exchange reserves, and now they're telling everybody, you better fucking buy more of our, like, buy up our dollars, please, or whatever. Stop fucking dumping them. You're screwing with us. So it's America wants to have their cake and eat it too, no matter what, all the time, every day, 24/7. So time for that to end.
Regional peers and international benchmarks, such as holding enough reserves to cover at least 3 months of imports, Vietnam's reserves were dangerously thin. In the face of massive capital inflows driven by the trade war, the SBV saw an opportunity to purchase dollars and build a...
Yeah, Jacqueline, I figured it'd be getting... Thank you for sticking with me so far. Going to call it a night because I'm getting tired. Thanks for the show. I should watch on the replay. Good night. Take care. Yeah. Peace. Sweet dreams. And I'll see you next week.
Much-needed buffer against future economic shocks. This, they contended, was a matter of prudent national financial management, not currency warfare. The arguments from Hanoi were strongly supported by a chorus of independent economists who saw the Treasury's designation as a profound analytical failure. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, a respected Washington think tank, published a particularly sharp critique, calling the designation a substantive mistake that illustrated the broader problems with the concept of currency manipulation. The critique dismantled the Treasury's case on several grounds. First, the very idea of a currency being undervalued is notoriously difficult to measure. The PIIE pointed out the fragility of the economic models used for such calculations. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, for instance, had produced 2 separate assessments for Vietnam's currency in 2018, with wildly divergent results. One model, the External Balance Assessment, found the dong to be 8.4% undervalued. But another, the Real Effective Exchange Rate model, found it to be 15.2% overvalued. This massive discrepancy highlighted that these methodologies provide, at best, very rough and fragile answers,
and we find that this problem is all over in statistics, okay? Because this is the same, I see this with the inflation measures all the time too. You got the official government inflation measure. I think in Canada we call it the CPI or whatever, unless I got that mixed up. But that's a bullshit measure as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of people always criticize it. Say, well, how is inflation actually that low? There's no way. When we go buy our stuff at various businesses, pay for gas at the pump or whatever, we know that the number is way higher. Because if you use these other metrics, they tell you a different story. So which metric is the one that's trustworthy? It shows you bourgeois economics is like a hall of mirrors. You walk into it, you're not sure if you're ever going to get out, but it's like not really designed to give you a clear perception, you know.
Far from the kind of precise science that should trigger punitive trade actions. Second, the critics lambasted the Treasury's reliance on the bilateral trade balance. There is widespread agreement among economists that a bilateral trade figure is a poor and misleading indicator of a country's overall economic policies. A country's global current account balance is the more relevant metric, and Vietnam's, at 1.2% of GDP in 2020, was relatively small and had actually decreased from the previous.
I'm saying, to address Sean's comment, to him inflation is fake, not that it doesn't exist, but that it shouldn't. Yeah, there's a lot of things like that. Artificial is maybe a good term instead of fake, because you can artificially manufacture synthetically created things, right? So inflation is like a man-made problem. It's the problem with the money system. If you get a moneyless system, inflation would naturally not really be a problem. But it's because it's only a problem because we make it a problem, you know. The other thing to mention is the whole thing about capitalism. Like, the capitalist system is designed to it cannot stop growing or it stops working. So the inflation is the way to justify, like, the 2% inflation. Like, it's healthy for economy to be inflated a little bit, which means it's not healthy for the country to not be growing. We have this fear of degrowth kind of thing. When we have this, the ideology is infinite growth on a finite planet. So obviously there needs to, like, deflation is not inherently bad, but the way that the capitalist free market, whatever freaks want to frame it, is that inflation is generally good unless it gets out of control. It's like taking drugs. Overdoses are bad, but highs are good. Anyway.
Previous year, the ballooning bilateral surplus with the US was not the result of a change in Vietnamese policy, but a direct consequence of US policy, namely, the trade war with China that shifted supply chains. Third, the designation failed to account for Vietnam's status as a developing nation. The Treasury applied the same rigid template to Vietnam that it did to Switzerland, a highly developed economy with one of the world's strongest currencies, which acts as a global safe haven. This one-size-fits-all approach ignored the fact that developing countries have legitimate reasons to manage their exchange rates and build reserves to protect themselves from volatile capital flows and external shocks. In fact, the Swiss were intervening to fight deflationary pressures caused by capital inflows seeking safety, a completely different economic problem than what Vietnam faced.
And that's an example of the U.S. targeting the threat of the good example. If you actually run your economy responsibly, that's really not okay, because that's a threat. That's you're not allowed to be strong. I'm the only one who's allowed to be strong. But that you make yourself and the whole world weak when you act like that, America.
Simultaneous designation of both countries exposed the absurdity of a mechanical, box-ticking exercise that was blind to context. Ultimately, the currency manipulator designation was a political act dressed up in technical language. The 2015 Act's three-part test, while seemingly objective, became a blunt instrument used to advance the Trump administration's singular focus on bilateral trade deficits. The administration's core trade philosophy held that these deficits were inherently bad and a sign of unfair practices by trading partners. The law provided a convenient mechanism to act on this belief. When Vietnam's soaring surplus made it a target, the Treasury applied the criteria mechanically, ignoring the exculpatory context and the deep flaws in the underlying economic analysis. The process was about checking boxes to justify a predetermined conclusion, not about conducting a nuanced and fair assessment of a partner's economic policies. The designation in December 2020 and the USTR's subsequent finding in January 2021 left the US-Vietnam relationship on a knife's edge. The incoming Biden administration inherited a ticking time bomb with the legal authority and justification for a trade war already in place. The resolution of the crisis would require a significant in US policy and a masterful display of diplomacy from both sides. The change in the White House in January 2021 was the critical turning point. The Biden administration's foreign policy priorities were fundamentally different from its predecessors. The narrow transactional focus on bilateral trade deficits was replaced by a broader, strategic emphasis on rebuilding alliances and strengthening partnerships, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, to compete more effectively with China. Punishing a key partner like Vietnam ran directly counter to this overarching goal. The shift in approach was immediately apparent. In its very first semi-annual currency report, released in April 2021, the new Treasury team, led by Secretary Janet Yellen, reversed the Trump administration's decision. The report stated that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Vietnam, or Switzerland, was manipulating its currency for an unfair trade advantage. As a justification for the reversal, the Treasury cited the unprecedented disruptions to global trade and capital flows caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which made it exceptionally difficult to analyze economic data and separate temporary effects from structural ones. This provided a convenient and plausible rationale for stepping back from the brink. While the incendiary currency manipulator label was officially removed, Vietnam was not given a clean bill of health. Instead, the Treasury moved Vietnam, along with Switzerland and Taiwan, to a newly defined category of enhanced engagement. This proved to be a clever and effective diplomatic solution.
That is pretty funny. I didn't know that, Sean. I like your other comments here too. The idea that more money makes it worth less is bullshit. What they're doing is adjusting for wage and tax growth. Yep. Well, I don't really know if I like this modern monetary theory stuff, but I mean, it's not necessarily worse than classical economics. Classical economics was fucking shitty, dirty balls. Gives capital the ability to charge more to minimize their losses. So yeah, it sounds very, where's the lie, right?
It served multiple purposes simultaneously. For the United States, it allowed the administration to de-escalate the conflict without appearing to ignore the statistical anomalies that had triggered the initial designation. It acknowledged that Vietnam's economic indicators still met the 3 criteria of the 2015 Act, but shifted the US response from a confrontational, punitive track to a cooperative, negotiated one. For Vietnam, it removed the immediate threat of sanctions and the stigma of the manipulator label. It provided a face-saving way to address US concerns through dialogue rather than being subjected to unilateral punishment. This enhanced engagement process created the diplomatic space necessary for both sides to find a mutually acceptable resolution and walk back from a trade war that neither wanted.
So, from what I'm gathering, the perception that Trump needs to make domestically is that he's that tough, masculine strongman who's gonna not be such a gay, feminine liberal and let everyone walk on America, wherever. We're gonna put everyone in their place. But then what's happening here? Whatever. He's been the softer, feminine, gay, whatever. Fucking. We'll work with you in order to not whoever be so chaotic and damaging. And then they end up, as far as you look at the tariffs, they were threatening like 40% or 45, was it 40% tariff rate, and then they dropped it to 20, which was like, just like with China, you know, they're taking a softer approach. They're acting all tough, but then they end up being kind of a what do you call it? Acting all hawkish, but they end up being all dovish, you know? Just something worth pointing out.
The enhanced engagement process culminated in the climax of the resolution, a landmark joint statement issued on July 19, 2021, by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and State Bank of Vietnam Governor Nguyen Thi Hong. This agreement provided the formal off-ramp from the crisis. The statement detailed a series of specific commitments by Vietnam that directly addressed the core concerns of the United States, but did so in a way that respected Vietnam's sovereignty and its development needs. The key pledges were reaffirming IMF obligations. Vietnam formally confirmed that it is bound by the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund to avoid manipulating its exchange rate to gain an unfair competitive advantage, and pledged to refrain from any competitive devaluation of the Vietnamese dong. This was a crucial acknowledgement of international norms. Improving exchange rate flexibility. The SBV committed to continue to improve exchange rate flexibility over time, allowing the dong to move more in line with economic fundamentals as its financial markets developed. This was a promise of gradual
So you hear that allow the dong to move more in line with economic fundamentals. Economic fundamentals of who? The capitalist world order, what they consider to be fundamentals that don't actually fucking work for anybody. It's just cyclical crises. So, yeah, there's just a lot that could be criticized in a lot of this stuff. But anyway.
Form, not a sudden destabilizing change. Enhancing transparency. Vietnam agreed to provide the US Treasury with the necessary information to conduct its analysis, improving the transparency of its foreign.
But yeah, the other thing I was going to say is trying to tie it back in with the topic of the video here is when is Vietnam being forced to make an agreement here? Is it kind of being vassalized by the U.S.? Is it maintaining its Vanguard kind of disciplinary, character? Or is its sovereignty being respected, like the guy said? Let me rewind it a bit. He said that the U.S. made face-saving measures that was respecting Vietnam's sovereignty, but we throw around the word vassal state constantly these days, and it's maybe a little bit loses its value like anything else when you apply it pejoratively as opposed to objectively. So is Vietnam sovereign? I think a lot of people would say yes. Are they a vassal state? No. People would argue they're a vassal state of China. People would argue they're a vassal state of the U.S. It can't be both at the same time. And as a vassal state, literally can only be a vassal of one superpower or larger state at a time. So we kind of need to maybe analyze what are there contradictions there. I don't know.
This agreement provided the formal off-ramp from the crisis. The statement detailed a series of specific commitments by Vietnam that directly addressed the core concerns of the United States, but did so in a way that respected Vietnam's sovereignty and its development needs. The key pledges were reaffirming IMF obligations. Vietnam formally confirmed that it is bound by the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund to avoid manipulating its exchange rate to gain an unfair competitive advantage.
And people have often cited that kind of capture by the IMF as a surrendering of sovereignty, and I feel that's usually valid. Is there a way to adhere to the policies? Is there a way to adhere to the enforcement of the IMF without giving up sovereignty? Somebody want to make that argument for me?
And pledged to refrain from any competitive devaluation of the Vietnamese dong. This was a crucial acknowledgement of international norms. Improving exchange rate flexibility. The SBV committed to continue to improve exchange rate flexibility over time, allowing the dong to move more in line with economic fundamentals as its financial markets developed. This was a promise of gradual reform, not a sudden destabilizing change.
Imagine being able to build anything just by thinking about
not having commercials or having to pay for an ad blocker. Oh, what a world it would be to not have advertising.
Enhancing transparency. Vietnam agreed to provide the US Treasury with the necessary information to conduct its analysis, improving the transparency of its foreign exchange interventions and reserve holdings. This addressed a key US complaint about the opacity of the SBV's operations. The July 2021 agreement was the key that unlocked the diplomatic solution. Just days later, USTR Catherine Tai announced that her office was formally terminating its Section 301 investigation and would not be imposing any tariffs on Vietnam. She cited the Treasury SBV agreement as a satisfactory resolution of the matter. The Treasury Department followed suit, with subsequent reports noting that it was satisfied with progress made by Vietnam in addressing US concerns. The crisis, which had threatened to fracture a vital strategic partnership, had been successfully diffused. The successful negotiation of the July 2021 agreement marked the end of the acute phase of the currency crisis. However, it did not resolve the underlying structural issues that caused it in the first place. The story of the US-Vietnam trade relationship has been one of an uneasy truce, where the potential...
That's something actually I feel is a recurring story around the world. He's saying they managed to make some kind of an agreement for now, but the underlying core contradictions are unresolved, sort of like the 2008 financial crisis and the massive financial crisis we're in right now that's like being kept under the lid like in 2007. It's probably going to be another year just like 2008 this year. It should be. If they have any fucking sense, you need to let that shit collapse. You can't kick the can down the road like that. It's a disaster. Same thing with treaty agreements, whatever, like that are preventing more broader war with like a negative peace does not really benefit anybody. It might save lives in the meantime, but it ends up trapping us into crisis that it needs to be resolved. And if it doesn't get resolved, whatever, with a cooperative kind of anti-imperialistic mindset, because the U.S. tries to finish all of its deals with other nations in an imperialistic manner. It wants to win every engagement, okay? But a win-win cooperation, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist kind of democracy, diplomacy on the world stage would be a rejection of that kind of predatory contract making. But we're not really able to be there.
However, it did not resolve the underlying structural issues that caused it in the first place. The story of the US-Vietnam trade relationship since then has been one of an uneasy truce, where the potential for friction remains, even as the overall strategic partnership deepens to unprecedented levels. Despite the resolution, Vietnam remains on the US Treasury's monitoring list to this day. An economy is placed on this list if it meets 2 of the 3 criteria from the 2015 Act, and once on the list, it typically stays there for at least 2 consecutive reports to ensure any improvement is durable. An analysis of the most recent Treasury reports reveals a consistent pattern. Vietnam no longer meets the criterion for persistent, one-sided intervention. In fact, in 2022 and 2020, was selling dollars to support the dong against depreciation pressure. However, it continues to meet the other 2 criteria. The bilateral trade surplus with the US remains massive, hitting $123.5 billion in 2024, far exceeding the updated threshold of $15 billion. And its global current account surplus has remained above the 3% of GDP threshold. This demonstrates that while the acute crisis is over, the statistical tripwires that caused it are still active. The fundamental economic imbalance, driven largely by Vietnam's role as a key node in global supply chains, persists. This lingering economic tension makes
you see that language, the key node in whatever, like there's this cybernetics, the technocratic kind of backdrop to all of this that I think needs to be picked up on. The language that they're using with multipolarity and this kind of stuff, it is this cybernetic technocratic kind of vision that they are rolling out, this 4th industrial revolution stuff. So this video is just about over. I'm going to let it finish up, and then I'm going to finish up the video. The last thing I want to talk about is that 4th industrial revolution shit. I'm going to just briefly touch on that, and then we're going to get out of here. All right.
Trajectory of the overall US-Vietnam relationship all the more remarkable. The currency dispute proved to be a significant bump in the road, but it did not derail the journey toward a closer strategic alignment. Even as the trade friction was at its peak, high-level engagement continued. Vice President Kamala Harris visited Hanoi in August 2021, just a month after the currency agreement was signed. The culmination of this deepening trust came in September 2023, during President Joe Biden's visit to Hanoi. The 2 nations officially elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This is the highest tier in Vietnam's diplomatic hierarchy, a status previously reserved for countries like China and Russia. It was a powerful signal that both Washington and Hanoi viewed their shared strategic interests as paramount, capable of overriding periodic economic disagreements. In the end, the currency dispute served as a critical stress test for the US-Vietnam partnership. It exposed the inherent conflict between America's rigid, often domestically focused trade enforcement laws and its flexible, forward-looking geopolitical strategy. The fact that strategic imperatives, namely the shared goal of building a prosperous and stable Indo-balancing the influence of a rising China, ultimately triumphed over the trade friction, is a testament to the profound depth and importance of the relationship. Yet the episode also serves a permanent cautionary tale. The underlying economic imbalances that sparked the crisis have not disappeared. As long as they persist, and as long as US trade law remains a blunt instrument, the potential for another friendly fire incident will remain a latent feature of this indispensable, yet endlessly complex, 21st century partnership.
And there we have it, that chilling warning. As long as the US decides to continue being that intransigent, nasty motherfucker that it is, everything is still set to fall apart. Whatever. We can't have nice things as long as that's going to continue. I hope that was an actual real person narrating that video, because I worry nowadays how much of we gotta always step up our game. Like that probably was an AI created kind of stuff, or at least a narrator, not necessarily the whole. Like there's maybe a real human being making it, but I don't know if they're putting their own voice out there. A lot of people they don't want to put their voice, their face out there. So now, as important as it is for protecting your identity, I get that online, the consequence is that the rest of us can't tell if you're a fucking bot or not. So let me share this World Economic Forum tab with you, because apparently Vietnam is opened in 2024, launched a center for the fourth industrial revolution. So grab your Klaus Schwab pearls, clutch them dearly, because this is scary. Or isn't it, right? You're telling me it's not? I need some communists to explain to me how Klaus Schwab is the reason why he's China and Vietnam's best friend and that kind of thing. I don't really get it, you know. I need someone to explain to me how we got all that stuff about COVID wrong, right? And how you guys are on the right side of history with the people sending tainted vaccines around the world for very questionable whatever you call it, infectivity of a virus that may or may not kind of exist. Stuff. Let's not get into that at the moment, but we're going to have to get round back to that at some point, because it really determines whether or not China's revolutionary, right? If the whole Great Reset people were practicing some kind of genocide through vaccines, kind of what it looks like. But that's very controversial. Them's fighting words. So this is published January 16, 2024. The World Economic, in collaboration with the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City, will establish a center for the fourth industrial revolution in Vietnam in 2024. Second center to be established in Southeast Asia, C4IR Vietnam, will focus on green growth. I don't think it's green. I think it's that eco-fascism. Okay, but that's I don't call it that usually when I'm talking about a communist nation. But if it's an alliance with the WEF, is that a red-brown alliance or not, kind of thing. So there's that, and here's my other little thing about. So this is far as that's the WEF boilerplate statement. This is from ComSureGroup.com. This says the State Bank of Vietnam has deactivated over 86 million bank accounts. Dum, dum, dum. Is this a good idea? Whatever. In some ways, I see some reasons why, as hawkish as I am with all this digital currency stuff, you can eliminate a lot of the fraud that's going on if we tighten up some of this stuff. But I'm very worried about where we're headed with all this stuff. I got my biases. I'm not a very techie guy. So you tech bros, you save the day, please, because this is scary. So Vietnam's State Bank of Vietnam has initiated a significant data cleansing effort, deactivating over 86 million bank accounts. But in the West, we're all like, I don't think you have the right to debank me like that. We're making it out to be this big thing. Scott Ritter got debanked. We got to make sure we have solidarity and rally around him, guys. But Vietnam going to go deactivate 86 million accounts, whatever. Don't talk about it. So data cleansing effort, deactivating over 86 million accounts is part of a national push for biometric verification. And we like to complain about the UK with their digital passport thing. They're going to try and make up a reason to say, I remember recently they had to walk back a thing about, they wanted to tie your right to work to a biometric ID kind of thing. So in order to prove that you had the right to work, you had to have your digital ID, which you had to use biometric verification whatever to get, kind of thing. So that's this technocratic, dystopic, turnkey tyranny shit, where it's already tyrannical, but they're trying to make it even more dystopic. And that's what we see in the West. But in the East, because they're communist nations, when they do it, it's fine. I don't really understand that. I think that this is kind of indefensible, right? Like you can't be helping them do this. That's the capital, the WEF. Like, who are they? They are fucking private society or whatever. They are a private corporate organization, right, of the most powerful capitalists around the world. So I don't think you can you only work with them because you don't have a choice or whatever. That's called like fucking blackmail. That's working under duress or whatever. You voluntarily work with them. That's not Marxism-Leninism, as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand what the fuck I'm talking about, apparently, because all the more informed comrades are like nothing to see here. So this initiative stems from Project 06, a government project launched in 2022 to develop a unified digital identity system with a goal of full implementation by 2025 and a vision extending to 2030. The goal is to create a cashless society, reduce fraud, and align with international standards such as those established by the OECD and the BIS. I didn't think that those were particularly Marxist-Leninist organizations, but reducing fraud sounds good. Create a moneyless society, because you're going to have a cashless society and we're still going to have a money society. So that's where I think a lot of people are thinking maybe that this is one step along the way to a moneyless society, but from what I can tell, you're going to take away the ability for me to save money by using cash and getting change back. Instead, when I have to use my debit card or whatever, the bank keeps all that extra change, right? So that's kind of what you're doing. You're allowing the wealth transfer upwards by the digitalization of things again, as if there hasn't been enough transfers upwards. But I guess there could be, as far as a caveat, I could be having a little bit of a conspiratorial kind of reaction, like a reactionary kind of position when I learn about this kind of stuff. So with a population of approximately 101 million, Vietnam had roughly 200 million bank accounts before this, many of which were inactive, duplicate, or used for scams, resulting in around 113 million personal and 711,000 organizational accounts remaining active after verification. So that's basically it. I think it just repeats itself a few times. So I leave it to you. I ask you, the audience, is this just a pragmatic efficiency thing? It's a technocratic thing, or whatever. We're just making things more efficient. And then by making things more efficient, we are actually benefiting the people we're actually walking the walk instead of just talking the talk. Okay, but you're creating digital dependency, which is not so much about liberating the proletariat. It's more about finding ways to re-exploit them, re-entrench the class relations. So lots to pay attention to. I think we got these last 5 communist run nations. We should all be watching them closely through this important period of history we're going through, because it will definitely give us insight as to whether we are on the right side of history, whether we're supporting the actual cause or not, whether communism is dead or not. I don't think it is. I think that capitalist propaganda, with the end of the Cold War, with the end of the USSR, that was the definitive defeat of communism. And they're now looking to, with the trade war with China, it seems like maybe the U.S. is forced into a Pyrrhic victory situation here, or a Pyrrhic defeat, whatever. Like, if they can't maintain their U.S. dollar hegemony, whatever, then the way that they're going to win is ideologically, by making China into such a hypocrite that globally communism still doesn't take off, because the rest of the world doesn't really see China as communist. They see them as imperialist. And then eventually it's just a matter of time before the US gets back kind of on top. I hope that's not going to happen. It's all to be continued, whatever. We're all going to find out how honest people have been, where they really stand. It's just one of those things. Whether they like it or not, we're all going to find out. So I've been rambling on long enough. Thank you all for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you made it this far, thank you very much. I'll see you guys next week if you tune in. If you haven't before, feel free to come in and join the conversation. I'll be happy to hear you. Anyway, have a good night, comrades. Stay safe, be strong.